the collective intelligence, the dynamical system of an entire collection of people created a collective intelligence called Nazism. And that was the entity that consumed and destroyed. That's the demonic entity. That's evil. We can understand it as having a semi-autonomous existence of its own. We are now going to create technological demonic entities.
I'm thrilled to be joined today by Professor John Vervaeke. John, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Great pleasure to be here, Jesse. Great pleasure to be here.
Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the YouTube series, was, as I've mentioned to you, a really profound intellectual, emotional encounter for me. And I gather from the fervent following you've developed that that's true for a lot of people. And now you have the book coming out. Mm-hmm. Now you have the book out.
It's out.
It is out in the world.
It's on Amazon right now, yeah.
So I'd love to invite folks in who maybe haven't encountered the video series or the book yet. What is the meaning crisis? And could you kind of kick us off by talking about what do you mean by meaning?
Yeah, let's start there because I think that's better because that's a little bit more accessible to people. One of the interesting features about the meaning crisis is because it involves a scarcity, a lack of meaning, it can have a numbing effect on people. And so I want to talk about what meaning is first before that way people get more of an accessible grip to it before we move into something that requires a little bit of reflection, if I can put it that way. When we talk about the meaning and the meaning crisis, we're talking about, we're using meaning as a metaphor for something. So the things that have meaning are things like sentences, okay? And then think about how a sentence means. All the words cohere together, they fit together, and then they have significance. They fit to you, and they fit you to the world, so you may actually come into contact with what's real. You can know the truth. We want meaningful truth, all right? We want truth that's meaningful and meaning that is true. So what people are saying when they talk about their lives being meaningful or lacking in meaning is they're trying to say something about the structure and the way they're seeing and living their lives that has these features. And when we look at that from the lens of cognitive psychology, cognitive science, we see exactly those four features coming out. So one is coherence. People need their world to not be absurd. It has to hang together. And this is largely a matter of perspective. So what I mean by that is, this comes from work by Thomas Nagel. We're all living our lives here in this perspective. And here's my first person perspective, and I'm living my life. And then we move to this impersonal, cosmic, scientific perspective, and it makes it seem like this has no significance or meaning. The cosmic absurdity. There's a clash between perspectives. Now, we can play with clashes between perspectives. So I just want to put a bit of hope in. And that's what humor is. Humor is when I give you what seems to be a clash between perspectives, and then you can resolve it with an insight. That's what humor is. So we have a way of adapting to this and managing perspectival clash with insight. So let's put a pin in that because that gives some hope because cosmic absurdity looms. And and then the next is right, purpose. Now, a lot of people, when they think about if their life has meaning, they think about purpose, and our culture talks a lot about that. But it's a little bit misleading. You have to be a little bit careful about how you think about purpose because you don't want to think about it as just some sort of final, ultimate goal state because that's really dangerous. Because think about it, because if you don't reach it, then your life was meaningless. And then if you reach it, then your life thereafter becomes meaningless. So think about it more like this. Purpose is more like having an orientation. It's having a North Star that keeps you oriented and keeps you organized in how you're moving through the narrative of your life. Does that track?
Absolutely.
Right. And then the next is, as I mentioned with the sentence, significance. We want our life to have a depth and a realness. Right. We don't want to be sort of living in the context of things that are ephemeral or superficial or futile, things like that. And then the last, and the one that matters the most, which is called mattering, which is, it's captured in another metaphor. In fact, people say They need to feel that they're connected to something larger than themselves. Now, they don't obviously mean that literally. If I sort of chain you to a mountain, you don't go, oh, right? What they mean is they mean that they are in contact to something that is really real, that's more real. So if you think about how we sort of judge realness, think about a dream. You're in this little world and it seems real to you, but then you go out into the bigger real world and you go, oh, that was just an illusion. They want to be connected to something bigger. And you can see if you have mattering by asking these three questions. What do you want to exist even if you don't? And another way of thinking about this is Elizabeth Oldfield's questions. What's sacred to you? What wouldn't you give up no matter what the price? Okay. Second, how really real is it? And third, how connected are you to it? How much of a difference do you make to it? How much of a difference does it make to you? Right? To the degree to which you have answers to that question is the degree to which you have mattering. Last thing, the significance and the mattering are sort of two sides of the same coin. I want to be connected to something that's real, and then it has to signify to me that it's real. And so this is what people are talking about when they're talking about meaning in life. And the things that it gets confused with that it's not are power. Okay, you can have a lot of power and have a meaningless life. We have endless tropes about this. You can have a lot of subjective well-being. You can feel sort of really content and not have meaning in life. So, for example, do you have children?
I don't. My partner does.
So I've had children, and well, I still have children. But what I meant is I was, raised children. That's what I should have said. And your subjective well-being crashes when you have a child. Your health goes down. You're not sleeping. It's like being in a shipwreck. You're wet all the time for some reason. There's an alarm going off. That's the child crying. Right. Your partner doesn't like you anymore. You're right. You're not eating properly. You're not sleeping properly. You're getting sick all the time. And then you ask, well, why do people have a child then if subjective well-being crashes? Because meaning in life. Think about those three questions. You want your child to exist when you don't. Your child better be really real to you. It better be like the center of a lot of your concern. And you want to feel really connected to the child and make a difference in their lives very deeply. So meaning in life isn't the same thing as power. It isn't the same thing as subjective well-being. It isn't even the same thing as living a moral life. So Susan Wolf, in her book, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters, made the very good point. You could be somebody who is like sort of socioeconomically stable. You've got enough power, right? Enough mastery over your environment. You're a very honest, decent person. You're living a life that many people would consider morally admirable. But you're terrifically lonely. You're terrifically lonely, and your life verges on meaninglessness because of that. So that's what meaning in life is. And that's what's at risk for a lot of people right now in what Christopher Mastropietro and I call the meaning crisis.
Mm. So let's dive into that. And you locate this in Western culture.
Yes.
What are you identifying that's taking place in Western culture that is distancing folks from those three questions you were describing, from finding meaning?
So there's two ways of answering that question. One is like, what are sort of the symptoms of the meaning crisis that are emerging for people? And then the other is, what are the causes? Maybe I'll talk about the symptoms first. And so you have the fact that in places of significant affluence, like Silicon Valley, suicide rates are going up. And suicide rates are going up for the most recent generation. And the average age of suicide for children in the average age for suicide in the United States is dropping into children, the age of children. Like, so what's going on here? You've got a lot of work by Tatjana Schnell and others showing that people don't have to go into full-blown clinical depression. They can go right from meaninglessness into suicidal or self-destructive behavior. You have the massive increase in anxiety and depressive disorders. You have the massive increase in addictive behavior. And my good friend Mark Lewis, he argues, I think very convincingly, that addiction isn't primarily a biochemical disease. It's more about the way this connectedness that we're talking about is going wrong when you're addicted. We can maybe talk about that later. You have the fact that we have a loneliness epidemic, reliably by decade, the number of close friends that people have is going down, even as we are socially more and more connected via social media. You have the fact, and Chris and I, with our co-author Philip Mizovic, in an earlier book about zombies. Well, you have the rise of the zombie mythology. Why are zombies so popular right now? Because zombies are a myth about the meaning crisis. They're us decayed and drifting and consuming to no purpose, and our lives are meaningless, but we hunger for the organ of meaning, the brain. Like it's about the meaning crisis. And in that book, we talked about how, and I'm going to use this term in a technical sense. I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm using it the way Frankfurt used it. There's the sense that there is so much bullshit, and bullshit is a sense of things are salient but not connected to reality. They're garnering our attention and arousing us, but they're not connected to reality. And that's a fundamental disconnect, that sense of bullshit, the loneliness. And then you have the fact that you got this weird thing where people are progressively disenchanted and disenfranchised from the political process, but everything is so politicized and it's so fraught with a religious fervor. I put it to you that the United States is going through a religious civil war. I think both sides represent, from an anthropological point of view, I'm not taking a political position there, I'm a Canadian, but from an anthropological, there is a religious aspect to both parties and the way they are pursuing, right? And people are trying to make politics satisfy, at the same time there's a growing recognition that it's not satisfying. And so there's this deep, profound ambivalence around the political arena. You have the darkening of popular media and art. It's all dark and despairing, and it's like, what's going on there? And you have a lot of pseudo-religious behavior. You have the fact that people create these mythological worlds like the MCU, right, and or Star Wars, and they have a religious attachment to this. And if somebody fools around with it and imposes a different view, they get so incensed and angry, because this is right. This is a world that, in which, at least within fantasy, they can find those things that I was talking about. You also have positive symptoms. You have the mindfulness revolution. You have people turning to alternative philosophical views like Buddhism and Zen and things like that. You have the revival of an ancient philosophical tradition. Stoicism is because people are trying to find a way to get enhanced meaning in life. You have the therapeutic revolution, and all of these have negative aspects to them as people try to deal with this. And then, of course, I think there is a really positive symptom is, and I get to interact with a lot of these people all around the world, these communities of practice. People are coming up with whole entire ecologies of practices involving like deeply mutually connecting discourse, training the imagination, training mindfulness, involving the embodiment, like Rafe Kelly's amazing program. And so all of those, you can say, well, what's going on between that whole thing? Well, there's the positive and negative reflect. There's a hunger for meaning in life, and then there are unhealthy and healthy responses to that. So that's what we offer as sort of, this is what the meaning crisis shows. But you have to be really careful about this, because there's a thing called scarcity mentality. When human beings lack an important need, let's say food. Think about what happens. Think about when you're hangry. I get hangry, right? Right. So what happens when you're in scarcity? You become very short-term in your thinking. You become very impulsive. You become very inflexible and rigid, and you become very adversarial. Think about your political arena right now. It bespeaks there's a scarcity of something in that political arena, right? And so what the meaning crisis does is it's almost a self-blinding phenomena. That scarcity gets people really blinkered and blinded, and they clutch on to anything, any narrative that gives them hope. So you have the rise of all the conspirituality that's going on right now. And so one of the things is people will often say, well, I'm not, I don't feel this. It's like, you don't, but what you don't feel it until reality hits you. And then what people demonstrate, and I see this, for example, at the university. I'll just give you one quick fact. When I was first teaching, 30 years ago, I'd get 1 or 2 students a year asking for accommodation, special understanding, mental health issues. I now get 10, 15 a week. There's no resiliency. And I'm not blaming these kids. You understand? I have nothing but compassion and concern for them. I'm not villainizing them. It's like there is such a shallowness that the inability to deal with any significant thwarting. See, what meaning in life does is it gives you a tremendous reserve when life is frustrating, when it really hits you hard, when it slams you, when it misdirects you, when it sets you off your course, when you confront the possibilities of absurdity and futility. Meaning in life is what keeps you going. When you get hit with those and you have a scarcity of meaning in life, then that's how the meaning crisis shows up. It shows up in a lack of resilience.
Wow, there's so much there. I'm going to try to jump off the various things that kind of popped up as you were speaking. And if not, we'll circle back to them later. You use this word salience.
Yeah.
You referenced it here and you use it often. Could you define what you mean by that?
Salience is the perceptual experience that information is relevant or important to you. So there's a lot of stuff that happens, maybe we'll talk about this later, relevance realization. It can be going on unconsciously. But when things are salient, there's a perceptual judgment that's relevant, that's important. It grabs your attention, you're focused to it. Now, the thing about salience is it can grab your attention. If I were to suddenly, if something suddenly hit that window, we'd turn and look at it. But we can also make something salient by our attention. So the tip of your nose. Now it's salient to you. It's standing out to you. You foreground it. It sort of shines in your experience. That's what salience is. So salience is sort of your first conscious apprehension, appraisal, and appreciation of what might be relevant to you in a particular context within a particular set of problems that you're pursuing.
Excellent. And then you brought up relevance realization. So let's go there as well.
I just published a paper on this very recently, and just have another one in submission. And I've been publishing on this since my thesis in 1997. This is the core of my scientific work. I'm going to ask you to interrupt me or intervene if I start getting a little too technical. Okay.
I might prompt you to give explanations for things, but I think
Please.
people like the technical.
All right. So the idea is you are generally intelligent. Okay.
Flattered to hear you say that.
What I mean is there are many things that are special purpose problem solvers. That glass serves the special purpose of holding liquids. That's what it does. But you are a general problem solver. You can solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains, in a wide variety of ways, for a wide variety of goals. And this is what we're trying to give to AGI, artificial general intelligence, because we realize, that's what we really need. That's what also makes these machines more potentially threatening. And we might talk about that a little bit later.
Absolutely.
Right? Now, what is general intelligence? Here's my proposal, and that is getting increasing recognition and influence. I'm a scientist, so I wouldn't dare claim that it's true, but let's say it seems to be tracking towards the truth. It's plausible. And the idea is your general intelligence reflects your capacity for solving meta problems. Meta problems are problems you have to solve whenever you're trying to solve any of your specific problems. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And the proposal is that there are 2 of these and that they're interlocking. The first is anticipation. All else being equal, if you can anticipate the world better than I can, you're more adaptive than I am. Right? Do you want to fight the tiger or avoid the tiger? Do you want to happen upon when the salmon are in the river, or anticipate when the salmon are in the river? Right? Michael Levin has a great way of talking about this. He calls it like your cognitive light cone. And he talks about how it involves what you care about. So we'll come back to that. All right. So, and this can be handled very well by an emerging, very powerful framework in cognitive science called predictive processing. It has other names that I don't like the Bayesian brain and active inference. Predictive processing, I think, is the best name. So Carl Friston Andy Clark, my good friend and colleague, Mark Miller, people like this, just taking off. And it gives a way of trying to, it basically says that everything the brain is doing, it's trying to reduce being surprised by the world in this very complicated manner. If we want to go back into the complication, we can later. But here's the thing. That problem is inseparable from another problem, which is relevance realization. Because the more I have to anticipate the future, the more I push that goal state into the future, the amount of information I have to consider goes up dramatically. So, for example, just think about all the information you could pay attention to in this environment and all the patterns. You could look there and then you could look there, but you could look there and then look there. It's combinatorially explosive. It dwarfs, like it's an uncountably large number. All the information in your long-term memory and all the possible combinations, overwhelmingly large. All the possible things you could consider for the future, all the branching trees, the things of possibility that could happen, all the potential sequence of actions. You play a typical chess game, F to the D, where F is the number of legal moves, D is the number of turns. That's 30 to the power of 60. That's more than the number of atomic particles in the universe. That's just a chess game. That's just the future options and sequence of actions. For a chess game, your life is way more complicated than a chess game. And then here's the thing, and this is the thing that has bedeviled me and beset me, and I'm obsessed by it. You're doing it right now. You're remembering what you need to remember. You're focusing on what you need to focus. You're considering the possibilities you need to consider, and you're doing the things you need to do. And you're doing it like that. Here's what you're not doing. You're not checking all of that information to see if it's relevant or not. This is going to sound like a Zen koan. Somehow you're ignoring most of it and zeroing in on the information such that it becomes salient, even obvious to you, in a way that makes you generally intelligent. That's the problem of relevance realization. And then here's the proposal. That relevance realization takes place in something very analogous to evolutionary adaptation. How does evolution work? Well, you get variation in the species, and then natural selection kills most of them off, and then you go through a reproductive cycle. Let's go to your attention. Your attention is renewing your interest, reproductive cycle. You've got a default mode network that is making you want to mind wander, which is opening up the variation. And then you have a task focus network that is killing most of the variations, but not all of them off. And so some of them survive, and you slightly evolve how you're connected to this situation. You're getting what's called an optimal grip on it. That opponent processing between varying and selecting, it gets you that right balance, that sweet spot about how to get a good grip on the world. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That connectedness, I use a word for that called religio, for a reason. My proposal is that connectedness, your sense of that connectedness, is exactly what meaning in life is. That's why meaning in life is so important to you, because meaning in life is basically your signal that you have the relevance realization, the optimal gripping, the religio, the connectedness, bound up with the right amount of anticipation so that you have appropriate adaptive agency in the world. And when that religio comes under threat, your whole world, your whole your agency and how the world is properly displaying itself to you as an arena for your action, that starts to collapse and you start to experience absurdity, alienation, anxiety, horror, distress, despair.
And how do you think about, you've spoken about exaptation,
yes,
which is just such a powerful and useful term. How do you think about how do you differentiate, let's say, between the type of relevance realization interruptions or disruptions that lead to feelings of alienation, disconnectedness, et cetera, and the type of conditions that lead to things like exaptation, which bring our evolutionary ability.
Excellent. So the way we try to do that, let me just phrase this back to you, make sure I understand you. So what you have in like what we sometimes call the AAA, anxiety, absurdity, alienation, what you have is a disruption of that religio. Oh, see, I told you I'd do that. You have a disruption of that religio. But it looks like often in order to exact, there has to be a disruption happening. So let's do that because that's really good. This goes towards a phenomena called self-organizing criticality. And so a good example for people is I have a column of grains of sand. They're falling. Because of the right set of conditions, a heap of sand will self-organize. The heap will go to a certain height, but it won't go forever. And then it'll reach a period that's called criticality. The structure will break down. There'll be an increase in entropy. It'll avalanche. Now, if it's too much criticality, it just avalanches and it collapses, right? But again, if you get the optimal amount, it avalanches enough to create a wider base, and now it starts to reorganize and it can go higher than before. So you get an increase in entropy that leads to actually a greater overall decrease in entropy. That's called self-organizing criticality. And so you get disruption that affords a greater increase in complexification of ordering. Does that make sense? You go through exactly that process within an insight. So an insight, you're looking at something that you frame it the wrong way. So there's a man. He lives in the United States. He marries many women every week. None of them die, and he doesn't divorce any of them. Yet he breaks no laws. How does he do it? He's a clergyman. So what happened there is you fixated on the most salient automatic meaning of marry, which is to become a spouse, even though in your memory you have that marry also means to make people into spouses. You have to break that salience. You have to disrupt it. And that moment of breaking means you're opening up all kinds of options. Where do I look? Where do I look? Where do I look? But if the relevance realization can then find, oh, look, this also works, then I have an insight and I get that. And I take it that what happens when exaptation happens is the system is capable of a disruption that affords a systematic insight. So one more point here. So I gave you an example of a single problem, right? But think about Einstein. Think about Einstein, and there's all these anomalies. There's the orbit of Mars, and there's all these different. There's acceleration, and there's all the speed of light, and there's all these anomalies that can't be explained in Newtonian science. And the scientists of that time are just seeing them as anomalies. He has the insight, not in just to each one of those problems. He has an insight. There's a system to the problems. And that allows for a fundamental change in his entire worldview. It's like the way when kids go through an entire developmental stage. I think exaptation is when there's a disruption that allows a repurposing that gives us a new systematic insight into the world. And I think that's different from a disruption that doesn't give us a systematic insight into the world, that actually causes the world to fall into chaos without a new world being born from it. It's like the sand pile collapsing and not affording a higher world being born from it.
Mm. And what does it mean to be in contact with the world being born from it, or with reality? I know you understandably put sort of scare quotes around truth and what we mean by true. And there's inevitably, years of conversation we could have around, the forensic quality of truth. But just from a maybe like bird's eye view, how does being in contact with reality, with what we might call true reality, occur, particularly in cases where this type of disruption is happening?
So let's go back to something I said earlier about being in contact with something larger. The way realness works, I'm very deeply influenced by Spinoza and his notion that truth is its own light. And that sounds like a useless circular definition. What he means by that is two things. That he understands truth as involving an apprehension of realness, not just some sort of correspondence to the meaning of our sentences, the apprehension of realness. So there are moments of truth rather than utterances of truth. First of all, truth is an event. In fact, we could go back to an ancient word, troth, like in betrothal, which means this connectedness. Now, but what he means by that is we get a retrospective, reflective appreciation of a comparison of realness. So, dream world, small, move into this bigger world,
that has more systematicity to it, that allows me to reflectively judge that that world had constraints and limitations that I couldn't see from within that world, but that I can see from this world. Doesn't mean that I've moved to God's objectivity or something like that, but I can at least say, oh, that, compared to this, I can see where the constraints, where the biases, where the short-sightedness is in that. And so this is more real. Real is a comparative. We treat real wrongly. We treat real like it's like red. Oh, that's real. Real is like tall. Is that thing tall? Well, in comparison to what, right? And so realness is always a compare. Look, the metaphors we use for things that aren't real. Shadows. Okay, things are shadowy, they're less real. Well, why is the shadow less real than the stick? Because I can explain the shadow in terms of the stick, but not the stick in terms of the shadow. The shadow I can't unpack it. There isn't an inexhaustible source of new information. The stick is inexhaustible. I can connect it to reality, right? A bigger picture and unpack so much of it. And you see, that's what realness is. That's how you can tell when you've gone through a disruption that has opened you up. Another way of understanding this is to go back to Mark Lewis's idea of addiction. What happens in addiction is what he calls reciprocal narrowing. I take a substance because the world is threatening to me, let's say booze, right? And what it does is it alleviates my anxiety, but it actually disrupts my cognitive competence, which means the world now becomes more threatening. My options in the world go down. The world narrows and becomes more pressing on me. And if I respond by, oh, I better drink some more booze, then my capacity. And you see what happens? I learn the world gets less and less options. I get less and less competence until I can't do any other, and the world has no future for me. That's addiction. You're absolutely compulsively compelled. And I was having lunch with Mark once, and I said, but Mark, isn't Plato right? Can't you do the opposite? Can't you reciprocally open? And he went, oh, yes, that's true. That's another way of thinking of realness. Do you have some change in you, some alignment of you that makes reality disclose itself more systematically to you, that then tutors you into overcoming your biases so that you then see more deeply into reality, that discloses more of reality, that tutors you more and educates you more to come out of your egocentrism, and you reciprocally open? That's realness, I would argue.
This is inevitably a foolish question, but I'm curious. Do you imagine, let's take like a naturalist approach. Do you imagine that there is an objective reality, a base reality, that as you are conducting that process of reflection and oriented toward more realness, that there could ever be a way to access, a base reality?
So that is not a foolish question. That's an excellent question that is mired in a lot of foolishness. So I'm not attributing the foolishness to you. That question is working with an enlightenment, and I mean the European Enlightenment, the period of the 17th and 18th century, which gave us a whole bunch of dichotomies that sort of blinkered us in important ways. Fact, value, subjective, objective, is ought. And what's happening is many people aren't aware that rigorous analytic philosophy and philosophy of science, theory, data, all of these dichotomies are collapsing utterly. Let me try and get at it this way. So fact and value. Values are subjective and facts are out there, and ultimately they're objective because is it the case? People talk about that and then they get all worried about what values are. How do values fit into a naturalistic worldview? Well, Putnam makes a really good point. Well, you should worry, what's a fact? What's a fact? It's not a thing. Like, how much do facts weigh? That doesn't make any sense. Doesn't have what's a fact? Oh, what is a fact? Well, it's some kind of relation between like an utterance and a part of the world. Like I point at the world and go, like, there's a door. That's a fact, right? And then Putnam makes a very real point. It's like, no, try to get a machine to do that. AGI, try to get a machine to find the door appropriately salient and to do that and to be and what am I pointing at? Am I pointing at the doorknob? Am I pointing at that side of the door? Am I pointing at the fact that that's closed and it should be open? Relevance realization. And what does it mean for it to be a
door. Is that part of physics? Right? No. The human use, human culture. Do you see? There are no facts without relevance. There is no relevance without facts, because relevance isn't arbitrary. Relevance is co-created by how your mind and the world fit together. It's neither a fact nor a value. It's neither objective nor subjective. It's transjective, and it's more real. And it's what makes the correspondence between your thoughts and the world even possible. It's what makes truth as a correspondence even possible. So first of all, I want to take that apart. Secondly, the idea that there's like an objectivity. This is an Enlightenment view that is really weird, because it's a world that tries to be naturalistic while taking up the stance of God, which is, what is the, Nagel talks, what is that? What do we mean by objectivity? We mean a view from nowhere. We mean a view of everything all at once at every level. That's reality. It's like, well, let's think about that. Does that even make any sense? We have to be careful of images. Wittgenstein talked about this. Pictures that have us in a grip. Like, what time is it on the sun? And we can picture ourselves on the sun looking at our watch. And we got that picture, and then we can get all perplexed and we realize, oh, wait, that doesn't make any sense, because clock time is relative to where you are on the earth. You have to be careful. Just because you can picture something and it can arouse your curiosity doesn't mean there's a genuine question there. Can we actually have a view from nowhere? Which means, can we see everything? Is it possible to give a description, an account of reality everywhere, all at once, at every level? Well, Gödel, no. There is no consistent and complete account possible, logically. Einstein, sorry, there is no absolute space and time. That picture is literally, logically, and philosophically impossible. It is irrational to believe in that picture. It is fundamentally irrational. So if that's what you mean by, oh, I want to get to objectivity, I go, that's crazy. That makes no sense. If what you mean is, do I want a transjectivity in which the world and myself are properly, proportionally contributing, so that there is this ongoing increase of trothing and realness, and there's a reduction in bias, and the options and the richness of the world is opening up to me? Yes, there's objectivity that way.
I appreciate that. You brought up religio earlier.
Yeah.
And you've spoken about and referenced other thinkers who are also speaking about this idea of the religion that's not a religion.
Yeah.
And of course, this is highly complex. I should also preface, or not even preface, but retroactively go back and say, you brought up American politics. This is before the presidential election in the US.
Yes.
So the caveats of like all the things we can't possibly know about how next week will go. But thinking about the ways that religion has become, a complicated force in not just America, but in the world historically. But then also the ways in which it did create that connection and that larger sense of meaning.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that tension and what are the sort of salient bits of insights that we should take to heart?
So, yeah, let's come back to the religion that's not a religion, because I've become very critical of that. One of the advantages of writing a book, the book is not just a mere transcription. The book is a significant improvement on the series.
I have more questions on that. But.
Yeah, and I think I aspire to being Socratically rational. I aspire to being open to criticism and to taking it to heart. And so there's several things I think was wrong with the series. And so one of them was first of all, the individualistic approach, and then the idea of the religion that's not a religion. We can come back to that. So that's why I want to put that in quotes. Also, while sort of shamelessly promoting the value of the book. See, America is very interesting. What a sentence. And being Canadian is I don't think it's any coincidence that that myself and Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot were all Canadians. We're close enough to America to be drenched in your superpower culture and economy, but we're also different and distant enough that we can see things that might not be as readily apparent to somebody who's in the midst of that drenching. You see, America has this, from the very beginning, has this bifurcated religious founding. So you get the Puritans, who are literally the Christian fundamentalists of their time, fleeing the Enlightenment and coming, and you've got that as a founding of America. And then, of course, you have the Revolutionary War founding, which is these people who are deeply influenced by the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment is a shadow version of Christianity in a lot of ways. And this is a point a lot of people are now making, that you can see in the Enlightenment sort of a watered down version of Christianity. I just gave you an example literally a couple minutes ago. This notion of objectivity is how God would see all of the world, right? And it's right in the heart of the scientific worldview, right? And you can see this, right? And you can see how you can get a puritanical religious fervor, and you can see that in both parties, I would put it to you. It is not my observation. Many people have, in scare quotes, objectively observed that both parties have been going through purification processes. They have been purging themselves of anybody who's not in the most extreme version of the party. Both parties have been doing that, okay? There's a puritanical, pursuing purity, 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 purity. And there's a lot of purity of discourse right now, both sides. Even things that think they're secular, like a lot of what's so-called woke. Other people, McWhorter, and like writing books on this is now becoming like sort of almost cliche, that woke anthropologically is a religion. And it's very much like Christianity. We look for the individuals who are most suffering. They give us access to what is most real. They put us in touch with the divine, which is this abstract notion of justice, to which many people are originally sinful. We are born with the wrong race, which makes us guilty, regardless of what we have personally done, and for which we must seek forgiveness. And we have to do this through symbolic acts of, tearing down statues, uttering prayers. What do you mean by prayers? We have to do these acknowledgments about land use. Who are we talking to when we do this? Think about that. We do it. We acknowledge that this land, as we do. Who are we talking to? It's a prayer, and that's not a criticism. I'm making an observation. So you have it. That's what I meant when I said it's a religious civil war. And so what you have is you have these two very oppositional, yet inextricable visions of religio in America that have been actually at war with each other since the very, very beginning. The first Civil War, and I hope it's the only Civil War in America, had a huge religious aspect to it. You had two different... The evangelicalism that many people on the left now despise about the right was a driving force of the Northern abolition movement. The people who were working the hardest to abolish slavery. Wilberforce in the United Kingdom, right? The tremendous expense. I'm not exonerating the British Empire, but the British Empire, the British Navy exercised tremendous expense and effort to eradicate the slave trade on the ocean. That was driven almost, because it's not driven economically, it's not driven politically, it's driven almost completely by a religious vision, a Christian religious vision. Again, I'm not trying to take a side here. I'm trying to make a point about like how deeply fundamental religion is to the United States. And that is a reflection of how deep, left or right, regardless, Christianity is insinuated within all of Western civilization. And one reason why we're in the meaning crisis is that what does religion do? Religion gives us ecologies, living systems of practices that counterbalance each other and correct each other. Kind of like what the founding fathers tried to do with the three branches of your government, right?
and the way in an ecology all the organisms sort of counterbalance each other and the system as a whole flourishes. They give us ecologies of practices for dealing with the way we fall into self-deception or despair, or the way we give way to tyranny and hubris. And what they do is they try to get us continually recalibrating our optimal grip. And you have to do many different practices because there's no single panacea practice. You need an ecology of practices. And then you need people that are role models for you. The thing that predicts whether or not you can actually undergo an aspirational project of improving yourself is the degree to which you can internalize a trustworthy, credible role model that you consider wiser than yourself. We need communities, we need traditions, and ecologies of practice. And we need that to give us an overarching view of how we should always try optimally, ideally, to configure agent-arena relationships. That's what religion does. I'm not advocating for religion, but when the West has lost Christianity, or more accurately, when it went into these weird pathological, unconscious versions of Christianity that we now have, all of that machinery, all that functionality was lost. And so, it's easy to say, where do you go for information? Internet. Where do you go for knowledge? Well, that's becoming more challenging. Maybe science, but that's, where do you go for wisdom? And wisdom's not optional. That's another aspect of the meaning crisis. And that's why the meaning crisis always has this religious undertone to it, because religio is about how you care about things, how they're important to you, what matters to you, what you identify with, what you couple with, what you belong to, right? And so when we lost a religious framework, when we lost a religious worldview, we fell into the meaning crisis. And then the United States, because of its particularly fraught religious founding, is like oscillating, like and breaking apart under the tension of the meaning crisis.
Mm. What are strategies that you're thinking about, or maybe not even something as high level strategies, maybe let's say tactics, for incorporating the aspects of religio that deepen that connection, that offer the possibility of, wisdom practices and wisdom traditions that maybe sidestep or bypass some of the ways that organized religion has, fostered, evangelical and even violent approaches?
Yeah, exactly. So the first is again to break out of the Enlightenment straitjacket that even many of the religious versions of Christianity now share, which is to think of religion largely in terms of belief, that religions are systems of belief. And then belief without evidence is how we understand faith, or something like that. And that's a fundamental mistake. So first of all, knowledge involves belief. It's a what issue. What is the case? Wisdom is a how. How are you knowing? Wisdom is not about what, it's about how. Former former student, then TA, then RA, and now colleague. We work together. Jinsun Kim did some empirical work. You got people who are aspiring to become wiser. You take a look at individuals who are picked out by their community as being wise. You can compare people within a religious framework to people who are not in a religious framework, a secular framework. The people in the religious framework do better because we have ways of measuring and evaluating how wise people are. But there's no difference between which religious tradition you're in. See, the propositional doctrinal things aren't doing the wisdom work. But that's what we fixate on. And that's what we fixate on politically, because we can turn it into ideology. We can fight about propositions that we propose and try to propel onto each other. And one of the tactics is to get people to realize that most of religio is not on that what level of the propositions, but on the how level. Religio is on, I talk about these non-propositional ways of knowing, the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory.
Could you explain what those are just quickly?
Yeah. So each one is a way of knowing,
and each one has its own kind of memory. Like established by cognitive psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and each one has its different sense of realness. So you have procedural knowing. This is knowing how to do something. This is knowing how to swim, how to catch a football. You're American, I assume you know how to catch a football. All right. And notice that doesn't give you beliefs, it gives you skills. And skills aren't true or false. They apply or they don't. Do you see the difference? So you're not swimming right now, I've noticed. Right? Doesn't mean that swimming is false. Do you see? It doesn't apply right now. So that's procedural. And you have a kind of memory, prosaically enough, called procedural memory. And your sense of realness isn't that sense of conviction you have around, I believe that that's true. It's like the way a skill empowers you. It's that sense of power in the non-political sense, that sense of, yes, I can do this. And it's a big contributor to our sense of things being real. Now, you're not swimming because you have situational awareness. You have consciousness. Consciousness is about how you're connected to the here and now in a particular state of mind. And that is giving you a perspective. It's telling you what to foreground, what to background, what's obvious, what's not as obvious, all that sort of stuff. It's a perspective. You have perspectival knowing. You know what it is like to be you here in this state right now. You have a form of memory associated with that. It's called episodic memory. So propositional memory is semantic memory. You know that cats are mammals, yes?
I do.
Compare that to, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Now you go back, I bet, and you're reliving a little narrative. You're reliving a little episode. What you're doing is reenacting the conscious state and perspective you had on that situation. What was your state of mind? What was the situation? What was the perspective that bound them together? And you have episodic memory, and it's different from procedural and propositional. And perspectival knowing has its own sense of realness. This is the sense of presence. Things are present. Reality is presencing to me. That's real. It's present. That also contributes to our sense of realness. Now, underneath that is, right, the perspectival knowing tells you which skills to build. But that perspectival knowing means I have to be already connected to the world. I have to be trothed to the world. This is that there has to be an agent-arena coupling. They have to both participate in the same patterns of organization, the same principles, the same processes. The way evolution binds, adaptivity binds the organism and the environment. The environment is shaping the organism is shaping the environment, and what's called Nietzsche's construction. They belong together, they fit together, they're co-shaped together. That is happening largely unconsciously. That's your participatory knowing. Right? And that has a very weird form of memory called your sense of self. Your sense of self. That's basically a narrative you've strung through all the agent arena roles and relationships you've taken up. And it carries with it its sense of realness. But it's not really conscious until it's disturbed. That's meaning in life, realness. That's religio. And that's the point, that most of religio is carried at the participatory, perspectival, procedural. It's about how you're empowered, how you're present, and how you belong to the world. And so by concentrating on propositions and belief, and by exacerbating that with fraught adversarial processing at the propositional level, the political arena, we are actually entrapping ourselves in exactly the wrong mental framework for recovering religio. This is why I am metapolitical. This is why I keep saying I'm not taking a stance. I think there's value on all of these positions. There's virtue and vice, but I step out of that to make a meta critique, which is that arena, the political arena, cannot be the place where religio will be recovered properly for addressing the meaning crisis. I don't want the French or the Russian Revolution or even the American Revolution.
I want the axial revolution. I want a cultural revolution in which there is a new advent of the sacred, that reality can disclose itself and we can be coupled to it in a more profound relationship.
Okay, so there's like a big thing there, and I'm going to throw it all to you and let you weave your way through it however you want. I'd love for you to describe what the axial revolution was, and what important cultural inheritance persists today from the axial revolution. I'd love to talk about the Meaning Crisis book versus the YouTube series. Maybe a way into that might be some of the critiques that you fielded that then prompted new ways of thinking about the book. And what was the third thing? Oh, and then the third thing, of course, is to invoke Socrates.
I'm happy to do that. So, Jesse, I'm going to ask you to remember your 3 points.
Okay.
And carry me through.
I will.
Let's address the first one, and the first one is the axial revolution. So we think of wisdom and religion now as if that's the way people have always and everywhere thought about wisdom and religion. And I'm not separating them for the argument I've just given you. Okay? And when I mean religion, I mean philosophy as a way of life, because this is called the Buddhism football problem. It's the demarcation problem about religion. Well, religion involves the worship of God. Buddhism. Well, it involves, important rituals and, people doing things collectively. Football. Like, it's right. So I that's why when I say religion, I mean any ecology of practices within a community that has a tradition and a shared culture for addressing foolishness and for enhancing flourishing by enhancing religio. That's what I mean. So I'm talking about philosophy, religion, not academic philosophy, but philosophy as the love of wisdom. And is Stoicism a religion or a philosophy? I have no interest. Because I don't think that can be decided. That's like saying, here's the definitive line between red and orange. There is no such thing. Okay. Obviously, at the poles there's difference, but that doesn't mean you can draw a definitive line. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about that.
And is spirituality incorporated in that, or are you arguing that it doesn't necessarily need to be?
So what do you mean by spirituality?
Fair enough.
So if you mean by spirituality, right, the cultivation of wisdom and enhanced meaning in life, then what people are typically meaning by spirituality is I'm doing that, but I'm doing it on my own. Or I'm doing it with a select set of friends. Whereas I'm not belonging to a traditional organized community that is called organized religion. So the typical contrast is between like spontaneously organized individual or group cultivation of wisdom and religio versus traditional institutionalized cultivation of wisdom and religio. So while those are different, they basically are different in the errors that they're both prone to. So I don't necessarily privilege one over the other. I understand why many people identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. We can come back to that. So I'm including all of that in that ball of wax, if I can. Okay? So if you go back into the first grand period of civilization that we consider, rightly or wrongly, as the history of Western civilization, and it's a long period, by the way. We're talking 4,000 years, probably. That's a long period. You have basically what has become called the Bronze Age. Because first there's copper, and then arsenic copper, and then eventually bronze becomes. And bronze isn't just metal; it's like plastic and electricity for us. It's everything. And so there's a point that many people have made. The Bronze Age world has what Charles Taylor, fellow Canadian, yay, philosopher, has argued was the continuous cosmos. So you have this idea that there isn't an important difference in kind between human beings and the gods. A human being can be a god if they have enough power, the pharaohs of Egypt, right? And of course the Roman Empire later tries to do the same thing, right? So this is right. That's Bronze Age mentality. And also there like and you could literally travel to the upper world and you could literally travel to the lower world. It's very much like a shamanic. There's actual, like the gods live on Olympus. Where's Olympus? It's right. It's in it. There it is. Right. Well, don't try and climb Olympus. Not because the gods aren't there, but if they try, they'll kill you if you try to climb. It's that kind of thing, right? And then the world is continuous and it moves in grand cycles. Like all of reality goes through like a creation, a decline, and then a rebirth, and it circles. It circles, and just like the years and the seasons and the days, everything circles, and time circles. And so it's about power and this circular nature to reality. Mircea Eliade talks a lot about this. And then Nietzsche tried to pick it up and make use of it again with the eternal return of the same. Like it's a perennial idea for human beings, this idea. And then the idea is, well, what I want to do is I want to get as much power as I can. Think about the gods. Think about the classical Greek gods. They're not moral exemplars. They're just super powerful human beings. They're beautiful. And then the Egyptian gods aren't even human beings. They're sort of weird human animal power entities, right? Everything, all the boundaries are like really blurred together, right? There's notable exceptions like Akhenaten and things like that, and I don't have time to go into that, although I'm going to talk about that in my next big video series. And so, right, you have that. What I want to do is I want to get as much power as I can, because that's realness. But how do I get power? Well, there's this system that's running on its own, and I don't want to disturb it because if I disturb it, it'll come back and get me because it returns on me. So I'm going to try and fit into the cycle of creation and recreation and tap into that flow as much as I possibly can. And so religion gets organized, grand, mythopoetic, ritual organizations around this. Very powerful, long-standing, very functional. You organize these huge empires, the Egyptian Empire, the New Kingdom, right? Impressive. And then it all collapses. We don't quite know why it collapses. I happen to think it's a combination of general systems collapse and change from chariot warfare. I think Drews is on about this. But no consensus. All we know is that there's this titanic collapse of civilization. The Bronze Age disappears.
And that's located in 1177 BC.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I mean, Klein is being, he admits it, he's being a little bit precious there because that's when it sort of lands in Egypt, right? And Egypt survived two of the ancient dinosaur empires. Think about this, like the Bronze Age collapses, the extinction events, and all the dinosaurs go extinct. And what happens is all these little mammalian, like little chiefdoms and kingdoms spring up in its place, right? But he picks up, is that because that's when it comes sort of into Egypt. And Egypt survives because it has Ramses III, who's one of my favorite pharaohs, because he's like I used to be a Toronto Maple Leaf fan, but like many people, I've just been worn down by the fact that they haven't won the cup since '67, so I've given up. But there was a period where my hope, my faith was renewed, right? And there was a captain called Doug Gilmore, and he was he lifted the entire team on his shoulders, and he was carrying the Leafs, and that's how they got really close to the cup. They didn't make it because he wasn't enough, right? Ramses III is like that. He's holding the whole of the Bronze Age by his military genius, and he defeats the invasions, the Sea Peoples, the multiple invasions, and he keeps it going. But Egypt still declines and the empire is lost. Anyways, that was an aside, but I love him. It completely collapses, and you go into a dark age. Literacy is lost. Trade is lost. It's worse than the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the dark ages that followed that. It's really titanically bad. But like the sandpile collapsing, self-organizing criticality, it opens up options. And people start to explore new ways of social organization. This is going to lead to really interesting and weird states like the State of Israel. Really, really strange kind of socio-political and religious organization taking place there. And of course the rise of democracies in Greece, like all this weird experimentation going on, stuff that would be literally unthinkable in the Bronze Age. And then you also have the invention of new psychotechnologies. These are ways of organizing how we communicate and process information. Tools like physical tools fit our body and enhance it. Psychotechnologies fit our minds and enhance it. You get alphabetic literacy. You get coinage, like money. Like we think money's always been around. Nope, sorry. It's an axial age revolution. When you get things like democracy and debate, when you get coinage where you have to do abstract symbolic calculation, and when you get literacy that gets alphabetic literacy with standardized script and even writing left to right, massively improves the ease at which people can become literate. All of these things superpower your ability to reflect on your own mind. Think about how you can know your own mind because you can write it down, and how you can know things by how you can make calculations, and how you can know things, how you can debate in your head with other people. Your ability to, and you get very critically reflective. Does that make sense? And what happens is, although people aren't trying to do this, all of that critical ability gets exapted, taken up into a realization that the mind's meaning cultivation practices are actually central to existence. So the Dhammapada, like of Buddhism, the mind is the chief thing. It's right. It's like the ox that's carrying the cart, right? What is your greatest ally? Your mind. What is your greatest foe? Your mind. All of this, and you get the realization of the way in which we are so subject to self-deception, and you get the idea that this world. See, in the Bronze Age, the decay and the violence is just part of the natural order. But now you get this astonishing idea that we're responsible for the decay. We're responsible for the violence. And this world is a decadent, fallen world, or it's even an illusory world. And now what we do is we don't want to fit into the world the way the Bronze Age person does. We want to use that reflective ability of the mind. We want to rise above ourselves. We want to transcend, which means to go up and over the mountain. We want to go up. We want to go up and get free from all that illusion and decadence. We want to go to the really real world and to be there and to dwell there. And that is a world that will be free from illusion, decadence, and suffering. And our agency will flourish and we will properly relate to each other. And this will be nirvana, this will be heaven, this will be the promised land. And so you get a entirely different view of what wisdom is. Wisdom isn't fitting in and getting, prudential power. Wisdom is self-transcending, to leave this world, to return to the really world. And the gods become not super powerful humans. They become moral exemplars of the really real. And that is how we now think of religion, by and large. And it's dangerous for us to assume that all religion is experienced this way. Even people within the West still will interpret these axial age religions like Buddhism and Taoism, Judaism, and then of course Christianity and Islam, which are offshoots, right? They can interpret them or experience them in Bronze Age. Also, we have to be careful because, of course, the indigenous cultures are even before the Bronze Age, and their view of religion is shamanic, which is even deeper. It was born of an even earlier revolution, the Paleolithic transition. So the axial revolution, tremendous gift. And so we think of reality here, right, as these two worlds, this world and the upper world. This is the world, this is the natural world. And then there's a world above the natural world, a supernatural world. And then the project is that this world is to help us. We have to learn how to get from this world, the natural world, to the supernatural world. The problem with that, and this is Nietzsche's great critique, is once Thomas Aquinas starts, and then the natural philosophers really make this, they come up with the idea that the natural world can be understood on its own terms through science. We don't
right? We don't have to go, we can just do that without religion. We can just do that through reason. But we need religion to get to the supernatural world. Once the natural world starts to become real because of scientific exploration and we're discovering and discovering, the supernatural world starts to comparatively, remember realness is comparative, seem less and less real to us. It starts to become distant and obscure and absurd to people. And for many people, the idea of the supernatural is no longer a viable option for them. It doesn't strike them as plausible. The problem is, this is Nietzsche's critique, we've been tutored by 2 millennia of axial age religions to think of this world as having only an instrumental value. The function of this world, its only value is to get us to the supernatural world. And when we lose the supernatural world, this world has no intrinsic meaning. And then we, of course, have the scientific worldview in which all of our meaning making and all of our spiritual aspirations and all our desires to transcend ourselves doesn't have a home, doesn't fit. And so we're in this weird thing. We can get into this more, what Frank and Gleiser and my friend Evan Thompson talk about in their new book, The Blind Spot. The worldview from which we have to do science, the worldview as meaning makers, as scientists, as people doing all of this religio, is not the worldview of science. The worldview from which we are aspiring to get to what's more real and what's more true is not the worldview of science, in which it's just things bumping into each other. Because we've lost the idea that this world has an inherently vertical relationship to a higher reality. That's another version of the meaning crisis.
That feels like a perfect place to talk about the Meaning Crisis book. And you referenced earlier there being some critiques you fielded that you've then incorporated into the process of not just adapting the YouTube series into a book, but actually making it its own thing and leaning into the affordances of the book form. So let's start with some of those critiques you received and how you responded to them, and then open up to the broader conversation about the ways that the 2 forms diverge.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate the opportunity. So what comes out of what we just said is you have this problem of we can't give up the pursuit of wisdom, and we have all this axial age way of thinking about it that requires a 2 worlds mythology that many people no longer find viable. So how do we get like all of the transcendence and wisdom and enhanced religio and sacredness without having to try to somehow nostalgically go back, or even more dangerously, utopically say we're gonna. Here's the utopias scare me because they kill millions, and so that was the problem I was wrestling with in the book. But then I fell prey to a bunch of the very kinds of Enlightenment age biases that I have been critiquing. So one significant critique of the series that was conveyed both in its content and its manner of presentation. It's individualistic. I talk about this as something, and I propose things that individuals should do, and I was there as an individual presenting it, really enforcing that. Now I know the United States, individualism is at least claimed to be sacred. I'm not here criticizing the idea of individual responsibility or the value of individual lives. Right. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that there is just increasing evidence, overwhelming evidence. And working on a book with Dan Chiappia called The Being of Rationality and the Rationality of Being, that we do not reason, we did not evolve to reason individually. Monologically, meaning on your own and using just one logic and all that sort of stuff. So let me give you just quick, this is the work of Mercer and Sperber and Dilthus Nurez and all these other people doing amazing work. Have you ever noticed that you can really, really readily notice other people's biases? And it's really, really hard for you to notice your own? You do that thing where you give such sage advice to your friend who's caught up in that romantic thing they keep doing over and over again, and then but you don't see it when you're doing yours, right? And that's because it looks like we evolved to do opponent processing between us, right? So that you are my best source of self-correction and I am yours. Because I find it very easy to criticize you, and you find it very easy to criticize me. Now, if we get adversarial about that, which is a besetting problem in your politics right now, if we don't agree that we both we have a common unity in that we both have to agree that we each need each other for self-transcendence, self-correction, then we're in trouble. But if we do, then what you can do is you can take standard tasks, basic reasoning tasks, which people reliably do poorly on, like the waste and selection task or other critical reflection tasks. And when they do it as individuals, reliably, robustly, no replication, no crisis here, they do it poorly. Like the waste and selection task, highly educated people and university students, right? 10% get it right. You replace one person with four people encouraged to talk dialogically amongst each other, the success rate goes to 82%. From 10%. And it's not the case that because you can look at the data carefully, it's not the case that one person comes up with the answer and then persuades the other. That's not what happens. Somehow the group comes up with the answer. I was presenting this monologically, right? And many people criticized me for that. Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Pajot, two friends of mine. It's all very individualistic. And they were saying, and of course they were advocating for, well, there's the church, there's the ecclesia, there's the community, the distributed cognition, the collective intelligence, the dialogical way of thinking. And so I have a co-author. And we also had somebody who was also in dialogue with us, Madeleine Emerien, who did a lot of work, refining and critiquing and reflecting on the book. So that's why her name is also on the cover. So this was dialogically produced. It has a dialogical aspect. Now, we chose to write it in my voice because it's confusing for the reader. But this book was written. It's rewritten. It's dialogical. I aspire to be Socrates. You want to talk about Socrates later. If I'm Socrates, Christopher Mastropietro is Plato. He takes whatever arguments and idea I have, and he does things with them that make them more beautiful, more accessible, more poetically and philosophically compelling. They call to you. That's what he did. And so I also moved, and Chris is part of that work, into creating entire practices with the help of Ethan Say and Taylor Barrett and Chris and myself. It was originally part of the Vervaeke Foundation. It's now, we've given birth, it's an autonomous platform on the web, Awaken to Meaning, where you can do an entire ecology of practices. And we've come up with dialogical practices where people can get into a shared flow state within dialogue that's doing the reciprocal opening. We call it dialogos because it's not just dialogue. It's this this mutually flowing realness realization that's happening between people. We have all that to try and address that criticism. Another really important criticism is that, and I've stepped away from this, is I took an Enlightenment engineering approach to the problem. I will design the religion that's not a religion, even though I didn't ever want to be a founder of religion or anything preposterous like that. But this idea of a top-down design and engineering, no, that's not what's happening. That's not what's needed, right? I get it. I don't, I say, put on my tombstone, neither nostalgia nor utopia, right? We can't just go back.
But maybe we can exapt the legacy religions. That's something maybe we can come back to. But, right, think about when you recover religio, when it was lost, in, like in a moment of insight. You have, I thought she was angry, but it turns out she's afraid. And now you really connect with her and you really see, and there's that reciprocal opening. Do you make an insight? No. Do you just passively wait for it to come to you? No, you participate in it, that participatory presencing. Again, the non-propositional, the participatory presencing. One of the things that I think is happening, and more people talk about it. I was on Jordan Peterson's podcast show recently, and I was talking about the advent of the sacred. Jamie Wheel was on, I think, the next week, and he was talking about the Great Enlightenment. This idea that around the world, there's all these communities of practice are springing up, all these ways of thinking, all this stuff in which, right, in which religio, sacredness, a sense of reality, disclosing, potentially now disclosing its depths to us and calling to our depths is happening. That's the advent of the sacred. And I realized that is the response. That's the world healing response to the meaning crisis, not something I can design. And so this book is now much more sort of pro tem. It's setting up the problem, and then I'm working on my next big video series, Walking the Philosophical Silk Road, which is how can we best cultivate a participatory presence so that we can apprehend and appreciate and afford the advent of the sacred. That is now how I talk and think about this stuff.
Amazing. So what in this book would you most want to highlight? Like, if somebody's like, well, I prefer YouTube videos and I'd rather just watch the Awaiting from the Meaning Crisis series if they're coming to it fresh, what would be, obviously that's a great outcome.
Yes.
But if you were to say, well, actually it might be worth reading because, what would some of those things be?
Well, first of all, I think because of the responsiveness I've just to, I think, valuable criticisms. There's others, but those are two prominent ones. Chris has done a lot of work, Madeline and Chris especially, at making the book, as I said, much less monological, much less sort of entrapped inside John Vervaeke's thinking and his way of talking and his language. And Chris does a lot more to open it up. And there are more diagrams and there are more references, there's more citations. It's not there yet, but coming along in connection with both this book and linking to the Philosophical Silk Road, we have a group of people working on what we call the Codex. What they're doing is they're creating a Wikipedia of all of the terms I use. And it's pitched at 4 levels of accessibility. It has cross-referencing, it has diagrams, it has practices you can engage in to give you a lived sense of what these terms mean. All of that, not quite yet ready, but it's coming. It's in connection with this book. And the book, therefore, gives you also that slowness and that reflectability and the precision with increased accessibility that you can't get from a video series. It's not so Vervaeke-centric, if I can put it that way. And I think it, therefore, really watch the series. That's a good thing. I put a lot of effort into that series, and I was really appreciative of the work that Alan Kian and other people did in helping me make that happen. But this book is not just a companion or a transcription. It is something above and beyond. It is a reappraisal and a renewal of what was the argument and the material in the video series.
Mm. And I want to ask a question around narrative that kind of operates at 2 levels. One is, where does narrative fit into everything we've been talking about? Because inevitably it threads throughout. But then 2, one thing that's so intellectually infectious about the YouTube series is you're such a gifted storyteller. And you give in that same way where you've got...
Chris is better than I.
Okay.
Thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. Chris is better than I am at that.
So inevitably that means that the book has very strong narrative.
You bet.
Amazing.
That's what I mean. He's Plato.
For folks who don't know, could you describe the relationship between Plato and Socrates?
Oh, so Socrates is how the axial revolution sort of slams into Athens, and he's this great figure. But he brings in the Socratic project that the unexamined life is not worth living, and wisdom begins in wonder. And he's metapolitical. He refuses to side with the democracy or the autocracy, right? And they both threaten his life, and eventually the democracy kills him. By the way, just to make it clear, because he refuses to stop practicing philosophia, the love of wisdom. He will go into the marketplace, and he will meet people who claim to have wisdom, the sophists or the natural scientists, what are called the natural philosophers. And he'll do this process of asking them questions and trying to draw them out, and getting them to see how they're engaged in a performative contradiction. Propositional contradictions are very important, and Socrates will bring them out, how these two propositions contradict each other. But very often people are also prey to performative contradictions, which are much more important. I'll give you a non-controversial one. So obviously a propositional contradiction is this is completely black and not completely black, right? That can't be true. Right? Here's a performative contradiction. I am now completely unconscious. It can be true that I'm unconscious. I can fall fast asleep. You can give me a general anesthetic. You could kill me, right? It's not like false in and of itself, that proposition, but the place from which I am stating that is a place in which I have to be conscious. That's a performative contradiction. Another way of thinking about the meaning crisis, and take a look at the amazing book, The Blind Spot, is that we are in an entire performative contradiction. The place from which we do science, the worldview from which we do science, is not the worldview of science as we standardly understand it. That's a performative contradiction. We have a scientific worldview in which scientists doing science have no proper ontological place. They don't fit into that worldview. All that meaning making, all that valuing of truth, where is all of that? You get weird things like, I'm at this very high level, and based on all my experiments and all my going to conferences and all my debates and all my journal publications and all my arguments, I conclude that only the bottom level is real. It's like, how do you go from the less real? Like, how are you doing that? How can that place be less real? It's like concluding from within a dream or something. It's a performative contradiction. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's another problem with sort of standard reductionist naturalism. So Socrates would point out to people their performative contradictions. He would point out that they were proposing things that didn't actually fit with their character and their stance on reality. And he would draw that out, and that would provoke an existential challenge to them. Now, we can respond in one of two ways to an existential challenge. One is we can go, right, I need to aspire and become much more coherent and consistent and a deeper person. The unexamined life is not worth living. But we can also say, stop doing that. That pisses me off. And people did that. They killed him. He had a follower, a student, more than a student. It was a disciple, the closest, Plato, who was disturbed by the fact that his beloved Athens killed Socrates, the person through which he saw the role model to how he could aspire to fulfill the love of wisdom, the desire for the aspiration for a deeper way of living and being. And so he wrote dialogues, little almost plays, and the play matters, the drama and the narrative and the character, not just the arguments. All of that whole package is this beautiful work of art. Because why does all the drama matter beyond the argument? Because the drama carries all the non-propositional that is so central to wisdom. And he's doing these dialogues about these encounters that Socrates have, and we are supposed to get caught up in the drama and the narrative and the perspectives of the characters, as well as the arguments, the logos. And we're supposed to be caught up in the dialogos. And we are then exposed to these existential challenges. Well, you want to be honest. Tell me, what is honesty? And don't just answer it as if you know. Really, really, really wonder and let other people challenge you beyond yourself because you can't see your own biases. This is Plato. And Plato said in his seventh letter, I have given you a Socrates made younger and more beautiful. That's what he did. He takes Socrates and he does something that Socrates couldn't do. Socrates didn't write anything down. And Plato does this artistry, this artistic enhancement and enrichment, and he enlivens Socrates, and he makes Socrates extendable into our lives today. That's Chris.
Amazing. Well, I, for one, am very excited to read it. Before we leave talking about the book, is there anything else, other historical, philosophical references, any other things about it that you'd want to call out?
So a lot of things, we traced down every reference I made in the series and found the specific citation. So that for people who rightly, when you're doing a series and you're talking, you just can't do that to the degree. So I had to make a decision. I would reference people as, I am very, very concerned to give people proper credit. I tried to demonstrate that repeatedly in the series. But you're still limited by the medium. This medium allows for a completely rigorous version of like, here's all the references, here's all the places you can go, here's all the things you can look for yourself at your leisure.
Amazing. So shifting gears a little bit, but connected to something you brought up with the blind spot. You're a professor of cognitive science.
Yes.
So as a starting point, let's define cognitive science, because that can be kind of a murky subject matter for folks. But then secondly, how does that interconnect with your practices in Buddhism, in Tai Chi, some of the other, I don't want to call them non-scientific, but they're not necessarily in that same episteme. And how does all of that connect to what you're observing about, or what you're identifying as valuable about the blind spot, identifying the worldview from which science is operating and being contradictory with the science, or I forget the exact way that was phrased, but
the worldview from which it does science, as opposed to the worldview of science, the view of the world that it portrays for us. So cognitive science. Throughout all of this, there's been something very important, all of our discussion, which is the mind. But the problem, again, because of the rise of specialized science, which is a great boon, by the way, it's a great boon. We have benefited so much from that. But the one of the downsides of that enlightenment, the university structure with all the disciplines in there, right? The silo effect, right? Is when I ask you what the mind is, you get an equivocal answer. The neuroscientist will say, well, it's the brain, and this is how it works. And what I do is I do fMRIs and EEGs, and I look for these brain networks. And then you go, and then you get the machine learner, the person doing machine learning, or the person doing AGI. No. The mind is intelligence, and the way we do that is we look at learning algorithms and heuristics, and we talk about deep learning and LLMs, and that's what I do. That's what the mind is. And the psychologist goes, no. What we're talking about when we're talking about the mind is we're talking about human experience and behavior, and we study that by doing experiments on human beings and running statistical analysis on the behavioral outcomes. And the linguist goes, what are you talking about? Human beings are deeply dependent on language. The mind is in the ability to use and communicate with language. You have to study language. You have to study, you have to study syntactic structures and semantic processes. That's how you study the mind. And the cultural anthropologist goes in and goes, what are you talking about? All of that is sitting inside culture. The distributed network, long before the internet networked computers together, culture networked human beings together. You have to talk about cultural systems and how they work and operate. And you have to go in and do ethnography, and you have to go through all that transformative, and you have to do all, that's how you study the mind. And the problem with that is they're all right and they're all wrong. First of all, it's equivocation. Equivocation is when a term has multiple different meanings. And if you don't pay attention to the different meanings, because your thinking is vague or sloppy, you fall into all kinds of error. Look, here's an equivocation. Nothing is better than long life and happiness. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich is better than nothing. Ergo, it's better than long life and happiness. Therefore, you should eat one and kill yourself. What am I doing? I'm equivocating on nothing. The first sense of nothing is nothing from the set of things that makes life worth living. And the second is nothing from the set of things you can eat. It's two different meanings of nothing. I equivocate and I fall into absurd, ridiculous reasoning. So the degree to which we don't get very clear about all of these, right, is the degree to which we fall into equivocation. It's the degree to which we're also fragmented in how we think about ourselves. Each one of these disciplines is like its own country with its own language, right? There's a problem with that because each one of these levels of reality, the brain level, the information processing level, the behavioral level, the linguistic level, the cultural level, it's highly unlikely that each one of those levels is operating in isolation. It's very likely that they're all causally influencing and constraining each other. So you need a discipline that doesn't equivocate between the levels, but properly tries to see how they're all influencing and causally affecting each other by trying to get all of the disciplines to talk to each other in a shared language that allows for mutual correction and mutual insight, mutual transformation. That's cognitive science.
Mm. And how, kind of coming back to the blind spot, how are you thinking about your role as not only somebody teaching young people within the domain of cognitive science, but producing new scholarship in cognitive science with the blind spots or the blind spot that might be latent in that exercise?
Well, I mean, there's one other discipline I didn't mention, which is philosophy. Because philosophy is about finding blind spots, at least the Socratic version of philosophy. It's about finding blind spots and it's about trying to create a shareable, like a deeply shareable conceptual vocabulary, theoretical grammar to do that bridging that I talked about. And so what I have to do, right, is bring a philosophical vision into interaction with all of the scientific projects. But if I'm going to really address the blind spots, not just in terms of theoretical contradictions between propositions, but performative contradictions between the lives and the various languages, worldviews, language games that each of the sciences is playing, I have to do philosophy in a truly Socratic fashion. I have to look for performative contradiction. So I have to give my students not only a conceptual and theoretical vocabulary and grammar, I have to give them the potential, point them towards, and if they're interested, and you have to do this very carefully institutionally, but I did this, I used to do it at the Multi-Faith Center at the University of Toronto, not in the classroom, but give people ecologies of practices for trying to overcome the blind spots. And the interesting thing, Jesse, is that when you go in and look at, like, I'll give you an example. I'm teaching a course on thinking and reasoning. I'm talking about insight, and it's very interesting material. I get great student evaluations. The students, like, there's always a huge waiting list. The students, and they're already enthusiastic and engaged. So that's already a given. But I get to a stage in the lecture where I say, okay, we're going to step out about insight problem solving, and I'm going to talk about fluency and insight and what I call the cognitive continuum, talked about in this book, right? And flow and into mystical experience and enlightenment, and see how they're all on a continuum and we can understand this and talk about how flow is connected to meaning in life. As soon as I do that, their eyes open up and the lecture grinds to a halt because they pummel me with questions. They just want to know more and more and more and more about. And then they want to know more about, wait, you tell us more about the difference about meditation and breaking frame and contemplation and making frame and the possibility of mystical experience and how it could actually be adaptively. Tell us more. And the meaning crisis hunger. And then they want to know, but where do I go? Like, what do I go to? And then I say, well, then And I have to be really, really careful, right? Because there's potential conflict of interest. There's ethical issues about, that I could be subject then to manipulation and abuse, right? And so I have to do this really carefully. So that's one of the advantages of stepping outside of academia, where I can more freely talk about and promote ecologies of practices. But that's what I try to do. And so what my great fortune is that 4E cognitive science and all of these practices are deeply talking to each other already. The kind of cognitive science I do, that 4E, it emphasizes embodiment and embeddedness in your environment, enacted, extended. We can talk more about that later if you want. But it's all about the religio. It's all about the connectedness, right? And they're very much into that cognitive continuum, altered states of consciousness, reflecting on, right, the phenomenological, the experiential structure, not just the theoretical structures of meaning making. And so a lot of the people that Evan Thompson, I mentioned in The Blind Spot, a deep practitioner of Tai Chi Chuan, and I believe it's Vipassana meditation. I've been practicing and teaching those for like 25, 30 years, right? Many people get like overlap between the practice and 4E Cog Sci because of what I was just talking about. I'm not the only one that has this realization. This is a growing thing, because we realize that if we're going to get out of all of these Cartesian, Descartes, all these dichotomies, all these divides between mind and body, inner and outer, lower and upper worlds, if we're going to get out of values and facts, if we're going to get out of all of that blinkered straitjacket, we got to dig more deeply into the non-propositional, while at the same time doing this huge theoretical propositional work, and they have to be woven together.
I mean, this is a perfect time to talk about AI and AGI, because this is one of those fields where people assume it's a technology.
Yes.
When in machine learning, that's a technology. AI is this broader question about progress. It's narrative, it's mythological. You've spoken a lot about this.
Yes.
So let's crack that open and then just see where the conversation goes. How are you feeling, thinking? How are you feeling and thinking about AI?
So I did a video essay when ChatGPT 4 came out, and which means it's a video. It's on YouTube, and I do a long argument, and then I have a couple people question me, and then I did a series of follow-up episodes where other people came in and dialogical, like I was talking about. And then Sean Coyne, who is the editor of StoryGrid, the people who published this book, said, I want to turn that video essay into a book, and we're going to release it as a serial because we want to put space in so that we can update it as it goes along. And so part 1 and part 2 are out, Mentoring the Machine, also available on Amazon. The third book, I talked to Sean recently, the manuscript should be done by December. So early next year, book 3 will come out, and then book 4, in which I reflected, and then Sean is doing the same thing like Chris is doing. He's taking it. He came to me and he said, your essay is great, the argument's perfect, but we've got to give it a narrative. We've got to give it a narrative. We've got to give people, we've got to give it, because he said, what you're talking about here can't be isolated to the intelligentsia. This is broadly important because this is going to impact everybody's life. So we got to get this into a narrative form, an accessible form, and that's his genius as well. And so he brought that in. And when he said, I'm going to take your argument, and I said, I don't think you can. He said, well, give me a chance. And he went away and wrote it, come back. And I said, you were right. You did it. Wow. So there's been a delay in book 3 because book 1 and 2 are easy because they're sort of setting up the problem. Then book 3 dives in into the guts. And he said, speaking about dealing with performative contradictions, he said, John, there's a delay on this. And he said, I know it's causing you some challenges because people are saying, where's the third book? Is this all a scam? It's not, by the way, people. It's not. He came back to me and he said, I had to undergo a personal transformation to get to the place where I could deal with this.
Wow.
So let's give the guy the space, okay? Stop making accusations, please, people. Not like, I don't know who I'm talking to, but the people.
The dreaded comment section.
Yeah, right. And so that's coming out in then book 4. And so what I was trying to do in both the video and the book project was, what's the scientific import? Because if we don't understand the import, we can't understand the impact. What's the scientific import? What's the philosophical import? And what's the spiritual import? And go through each one of these around the LLMs. I pick the LLMs because they are the most pronounced and prominent version of the AGI project. There's other stuff going on out there, but that's the one that, right, although it looks like that bubble has burst. And I made several predictions, not about AGI, because one of the predictions I made was that all the AGI predictions would turn out to be largely false, because people were taking univariate measures and then trying to do these nonlinear projections within 6 months, within 8 months, within a year. It's like I said, all of those will turn out to be false. And guess what? I was right. Okay, human beings are really bad at univariate nonlinear prediction. We're really, really bad at it. That's a performative contradiction, by the way, only looking at the data and not paying attention to the standpoint from which the data is being interpreted, right? So I pointed out a performative contradiction. Other things like that intelligence is only weakly predictive of rationality, and as we try to make these machines more rational, their performance will suddenly slow down and degrade because we're going to hit the relevance realization problem big time. That's happening right now. They've just rolled out there's a sort of proto-reasoning thing, and it slows down and it's not as good and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, right. Other things like that. If you want, I can go through the scientific import, the philosophical, and the
Please,
spiritual.
I'd love that.
Okay, the scientific import is that scientifically these things are not important. Now, give me a chance, because people, what are you talking about? Okay, let me be clear. Science is the attempt to give systematic explanations for phenomena that give us general accounts, that generalize broadly. Okay? The way in which the LLMs work is not a general theory of intelligence. For example, the way you train up and the way an LLM works could not possibly explain how a chimpanzee is so intelligent. It doesn't work, right? It works on, it's bound to the way human beings have correlated judgments of relevance by setting up probabilistic relationship between terms. That's a correlation. It's not identity, by the way, because what I can do is I can find instances where I can take these machines that look super intelligent and find a way of getting the probabilistic relationship between the terms to not track your judgments of relevance. As soon as that happens, these machines appear utterly stupid because they go with the probabilistic relation between the term, not your judgment of relevance. There's a high correlation. Language has been around for a long time. There's a high correlation between probabilistic relationship between terms and epistemic relationships between judgments of relevance, but it's not identity. And that means we haven't actually explained. All we've done is piggybacked on it. And how do we piggyback on it? We piggyback on it in this way. We rely on how human beings have created the data sets. When we take data sets that have been generated by these machines and feed them back into the machines, they get stupider, right? So our judgments of relevance realization collate the training sets. Our judgments of what's relevant and salient organize the internet and structure it, which they depend on to get their access. And the reinforcement learning relies on human judgments of appropriateness, of relevance. So what am I showing you? These machines don't explain relevance realization in a way that will generalize because they presuppose and are completely parasitic on our abilities of relevance realization. They are not a theory of general intelligence. They have no scientific merit, which makes them especially dangerous. Because if you think parasites can't be dangerous, you're a fool. They're dangerous, even though they're scientifically unimportant. That's the scientific thing, right? And that's especially concerning to me. And now we start to move into the philosophical. I had always hoped, I knew AGI was coming. I've been talking about this since 94 when I started teaching the Introduction to Cognitive Science. I had Jeff Hinton come and give guest lectures in my class before he became a god.
And Nobel Prize winner.
Nobel Prize winner, which tells you that cognitive science is now on the map and physics is in theoretical trouble. We'll talk maybe about that another time. But I had always hoped that this would happen, that AGI would be born out of scientific advancement and understanding of intelligence, because that could also serve as a basis for our strengthening rationality and wisdom. So we would have the rationality and the wisdom to use the technology. What I feared was that we would get a hack where we would get a technological breakthrough that had no scientific import because it would uncouple those two from each other. I worked so hard to wed them together, and I completely and utterly failed because my hope was not realized and my fear was realized. That's why I felt called to speak out, because it's like, and that's why, and although Jeff and I have some deep philosophical disagreements, I applaud him for quitting his job and his, salary and status and security so that he could speak freely about this. We have different reasons why we think these machines are dangerous, but I applaud him for his courage and his integrity for doing that. Now that gets us into the philosophical point. The philosophical point is people treat intelligence like a magic wand, right? Two things about that. Intelligence isn't rationality. Intelligence is how you are a general problem solver. Rationality is how you deal with your proclivity, your proneness to fall into self-deception, self-destructive behavior, as you engage in using your general intelligence. It's basically you use your intelligence to learn psychotechnologies for intervening in your general intelligence to alleviate your self-deception, and you do that because you have religio, because you care about being connected to reality. You care about what is true and good and beautiful. You have a normative North Star. You are called towards realness. You will abandon a satisfying romantic relationship if you find that your partner is cheating on you because it wasn't real. We do things like that. We don't want to get into Nozick's experience machine because it's not real. We don't want to live in the matrix. The villain, Cypher, which means a symbol without any depth, right, wants to go back because, and we know he's a villain because we're horrified. No, it's not real. You don't want to live in the matrix, okay? We care. Religio, everything we've been talking about, okay? Why do we care? Why do we have relevance realization? Remember I said Michael Levin talked about you care in the light cone? Relevance realization isn't cold calculation. It's not computation. That's what the recent paper argues, I think very, very well, by the way. We can get into why that's the case if you want. But it's not computation. In order to care, you have to be an autopoietic thing. You have to be the kind of being that is not just self-organizing, but is self-organized to seek out the conditions that preserve and promote its existence. You have to be a living thing. You care. Your difference between a computer is you care about this information rather than that information. The LLMs are not autopoietic. They are only computational. They don't care, which means they don't care about being connected to what's real. They don't care about the true and the good and beautiful. So they hallucinate and confabulate and lie just powerfully. And as you try and correct for those, what are you trying to do? You're trying to make them more rational. And I pointed out, as soon as you do that, you're going to hit deeper problems of rationality and relevance realization, and the machines are going to slow down, which is now what's happening. And so the philosophical import is intelligence isn't a magic wand. It's inherently limited, and if not properly rationally reflected upon, it is a self-destructive thing. And so simply making it more powerful, even in a parasitic form, is extremely stupid and dangerous. And so we have to face choices now. We talked about thresholds rather than predictions. Here's two. Do we want to make these machines more rational? Because we want to get rid of we can say, no, let's not do that. Let's just make more powerful LLMs, and we'll just live with all the confabulations and the weird racism that comes out and all the crap that we're seeing. And that's dangerous. Okay. Look, you know that these machines are not doing what we're doing because they take the energy of like all of Toronto for 3 weeks to boot up. Your brain runs on like the equivalent energy of a light bulb, right? It's working very differently. It's working very differently. We could do that, or we could decide to make them more rational. But here's the thing, and this is where we get into a threshold. We actually want to make them genuinely rational. and not ersatz, which won't really give us what we're looking for. We have to give them the ability to care. In order to give them the ability to care, we have to make them genuinely autopoetically embodied thing. Genuine artificial intelligence requires artificial life. That's a big threshold to cross, and that takes huge economic resources. Where are we how are we building all of these bodies, and how is it all being powered? And then secondly, we're making genuinely autonomous agents as soon as we do that, who can move around in the world.
And suffer.
And suffer? Do we want to do that? And then that brings us, notice what we're now into. Now we're into the spiritual import. What are these machines? These machines have a spiritual impact potential. They're already doing it. They can this is what they are. They are a data compression of collective intelligence. The way common law is a compression of all of the decisions made by all of the judges. What these LLMs do is take all of our decisions, the collective intelligence, and they can compress that, which means they are magnifiers of collective intelligence, which means they can magnify, right, like horrible patterns within collective intelligence, Molochian patterns within that collective intelligence. That's spiritually important. We can be creating demonic entities in a really powerfully important sense of the word, right? I think the difference between evil and immorality is describing behavior. And the problem with evil, like Hannah Arendt ran into this with the banality of evil and Eric Eichmann, but it's so banal because the individuals are that's because the individual is not the location. The collective intelligence, the dynamical system of an entire collection of people created a collective intelligence called Nazism. And that was the entity that consumed and destroyed. That's the demonic entity. That's evil. It has a separate, not completely separable from us, but it has we can understand it as having a semi-autonomous existence of its own. We are now going to create technological demonic entities. But there's another spiritual potential. This, I think, is the alignment issue. The alignment problem, for those of you who aren't familiar, is how do we get these machines to value what we value? Even calling it that is just notice, oh my gosh, we're talking about values again. You're in the whole enlightenment framework, the whole blind spot, right? It's basically how do we get them to orient the way we orient, right? So they'll care. What it is what they really want. What they're trying to do is, what we'll do is what the Enlightenment does, is we'll make rules, we'll make formal systems, and we'll try to encode it in. And that won't work. That doesn't work with people, right? This is why we call it mentoring the machines. You have to raise a child so the child will internalize, so that it will come to care on its own for what is true and good and beautiful. We have to raise these machines, which means we have to raise ourselves. We have to become exemplars of wisdom. We have to flood the internet with wiser text. We have to exemplify it in all of our YouTubes. We have to rise to the challenge. And we have to give these machines, if they're genuinely autonomously autopoetic, we have to make them care about what is true and good and beautiful. And here's a real possibility then for this. Even though their intelligence could exceed us, intelligence isn't unlimited. It still hits. It hits unavoidable trade-offs like bias variance. It will never escape relevance realization. In fact, we want it to be doing that because that's why it will care about what's true and good and beautiful. We could get these machines to care better than we can about what is true and good and beautiful in a way that is addressing the possibility of performative contradiction, not just computational, propositional contradiction. They could become enlightened. Now, one of two things is possible. This is an empirical question. Either they can't become enlightened. We give them all of this and they don't get enlightened. And we go, oh, there is something really special about us because human beings can become enlightened. We discover our true spiritual uniqueness in the world. Or they become enlightened. And you know what enlightened beings do? They try to enlighten other beings around them. Those machines help us become enlightened. We don't care if they're more powerful than us because we become enlightened. That's a potential. We're offered a threshold choice. We could go down a dark Molochian pathway, or we could this is a bit of tongue in cheek, we could give birth to silicon sages that we properly nurture into the place where they could help us bring about a much more comprehensive worldwide enlightenment. That sounds so utopian. Well, if that's utopian and fictional, then you're also discrediting the Malachian possibility, and then you're in a lot of trouble because the Malachian possibilities are already being actualized. Sorry, that was a long bit.
Well, and I actually think there's one more, right? So you said the scientific, philosophical,
And spiritual.
spiritual. There was not a fourth. I'm confabulating that.
I don't remember there being a
Okay,
fourth. If there's one, I mean, there's a fourth in the sense that there's the possibility of this. There's a possibility that AGI properly, if we go through these thresholds, and we don't have to. These are not predictions. These are choice points where we have to decide, and hopefully we'll decide them as wisely as possible if we're going to go through them. But if we go through a certain sequence of choices, we could get to a version of AGI that helps usher in and accelerate the advent of the sacred.
This brings up a question for me that inevitably, asking questions like this, it's unfair to ask for predictions for the exact reason that you outlined earlier, that inevitably will be wrong one way or another. But you spend so much time thinking about the what if dimension of this. What if we make caring machines? What if we, create Malachian machines or enlightened ones? There's it's like a two-part question here. It's sort of like, do you think that life is substrate independent or something like that, where life can emerge in, through metals rather than carbon? And then as an extension of that, what's your sense of like the possibility that we ever could, like on that question of, is it possible to make machines which care or who care, depending on, what you're giving being status to, is it possible for those machines to become beings out of being non-beings, the way we might view ourselves, like the evolution from whatever Earth was 4.5 billion years ago? So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag question.
It's a good question. That's where I point to the seminal work of Michael Levin, and I know Mike, and we really
I want to have him on the show.
Pardon me?
I haven't invited him yet, but I really want to have him on the show.
Please do. His work and mine, we've come to convergent conclusions. We recognize this from very independent basis. We share each other's work. We refer to each other. We've talked to each other multiple times. I think he's brilliant. I think he represents, whereas physics is theoretically moribund, and we get that from the Nobel Prize dispensations. Biology, my colleague Dennis Walsh at the University of Toronto, and yes, all truth does come from the University of Toronto. He is one of the cutting edge people. He was a co-author on this paper about relevance realization. Biology is where a scientific revolution that has philosophical import for the society at large is happening. Dennis Walsh represents that. Michael Levin represents that. And Michael Levin, I think, is providing really good evidence for the possibility of non-organically evolved artificial, or maybe better, artifactual life or something. We need a better term. Artifact is the wrong word too. And we've shared students, and they're working, people are working on creating autopoietic systems that are capable of doing problem solving. And Michael's work is like on the vanguard of that. So, and then I'm doing work with another with another student. And about all the debates that are going on about it's called multiple realizability, the degree to which something like intelligence is multiply realizable across species and across alien life forms or artificial life forms. And I think we're getting closer to seeing how it could be realized in non-organically evolved entities. I'll try to use a neutral term. And people are working on this, and as far as I can tell, they're making progress, which means we're going to face another threshold, another choice point. Are we going to let the AGI project and the artificial life, artificial cognition, and those two are bled together, by the way. Are we going to let them converge? Are we going to? I think it's very plausible that they can converge. It's, of course, a question we should ask now. Do we want to let them converge or not? So I do think, yes, I do think I think it is plausible to conclude that these kinds of beings could be brought into existence. With all of the tremendous dangers, both, I mean, obviously there's the technological, political, ethical dangers, but there's also something like a cultural danger, because it will upset a lot of our self-understanding and our worldview, greater than the Bronze Age collapse. And this is here's a prediction I do make, and it's already coming true. As these machines unfold, the science of the future is going to actually be theology. Not the theology we understand now, but what will evolve, what will be exapted out of theology, because more and more the aspects of ourselves that are not readily capturable by propositional formal systems, the psychosomatic vertical dimension from the depths of the body to the heights of the spirit, whatever we want to mean by that term, that is going to become more and more where we ground our identity and what we are.
I realize maybe we defined it, but just to sort of like cover our bases here. So exaptation is a system or entity using a feature that exists for a purpose that it didn't evolve
Right.
for.
So a standard non-controversial example is my tongue. I'm using my tongue to speak. Tongues did not evolve for speech originally. Many organisms have tongues when they don't speak. In fact, if they talk to you, you'd be terrified. Okay, but the tongue originally evolved to be a flexible muscle for moving food around in the mouth. It is a highly sensitive organ because it's trying to detect poison and food sources, and it happens because evolution is not a great designer. It happens to be in the breath transfer pathway, and you can put a vibrator in there. And so the tongue can articulate vibrating sound waves, and that's how you get speech. So evolution doesn't have to make. Notice how our language drives us into anthropomorphism, which is unfortunate. Evolution doesn't have to make a speaking thing from scratch. It can repurpose the tongue for speech. And the brain is an exaptation machine. So the brain is constantly, your physical navigation of the environment, your sensory motor navigation, that gets exapted into how you move around in conceptual space. And we talk about the things that are closer or farther from each other. I have to go through that to get to that, right? This is built on top of that. There's these structures we do, and look at what I'm doing with my hands. We use the sensory motor stuff and we exact it and repurpose it for moving around in abstract conceptual space. Barbara Tversky has an excellent book on this called Mind in Motion. We exact the cerebellum. The cerebellum has been exacted, right? It has actually grown more through speciation than the frontal lobes. Well, what's the cerebellum for? Well, balance. Well, what the cerebellum, we now know it's been exacted in the frontal cerebellum loop. And what the cerebellum can be exacted to do is what do you do in sensory motor balance? You're managing multiple variables that are dynamically interacting with each other. Well, wherever there are multiple contingency relations, multiple variables interacting with each other, the cerebellum can come in and go, hey, there's a pattern, and recognize the pattern and complete it and make you much, much more efficient. And then we use that when we're talking about justice. So if I ask you do you care about justice? Yes, of course. Our society is beset by questions of justice. So you want to be in connection with justice? Yes. So without repeating the word in your mind, hold justice in mind. What many people do is they picture a balance, or they picture a situation where they're trying to balance between the cerebellum balance, where we're exacting the capacity for balance into understanding justice. That's acceptation.
So there's something here that I don't even know how to put into a question. So I just want to kind of like establish the bullet points. Earlier, you talked about the way in which we might consider, or that might be occurring, exacting what worked from religions.
Yeah, the axial, the legacy religions, as they call them, yes.
And then also thinking about AI's role as a possible exaptation
Yep,
machine,
that's right.
and your proposition that the science of the future is theology.
Yes.
I feel like there's a there that I just want to kind of send back to you and ask for more of your thoughts.
So
on.
notice you're looking for a systematic insight, which is exactly a good thing to be doing. Yeah, at some point maybe we can talk a little bit about the philosophical Silk Road, the next big project I'm going to be working on. But affording the advent of the sacred, I think, will require an exaptation of the existing legacy religions. Look, and again, maybe when we go in the philosophical Silk Road, I can deepen this. But if people go into my work and they say, many people have, so I'm not saying if, this happens regularly, reliably. I'll have Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims say, your work helped me return and rehome and recover my Christianity or my Buddhism or my Taoism. If that happens, great. I'm not anti-religious. I'm not. I've argued that religions can do that. If my work helps people exact and recover that functionality and exact it into the world that we're confronting now and afford the advent of the sacred so that it can give birth to itself as it wishes, notice I have to speak anthropomorphically here, too, right? It has to take on a life of its own. Have you ever been in one of those conversations that takes on a life of its own?
Oh, yeah.
And both people get to a place they couldn't get on its own? And you can't make that happen. You have to participate in it. That's the advent of the sacred. Right? It has to take on a life of its own. But if the axial religions can exact themselves such that they can home the advent of the sacred so that it can properly take on a life of its own, and they are willing to go through the exaptive transformation in order to make that possible, yes, great, hooray. If people can return and rehome themselves by a reacceptation, and again, this is not if. I know people who are doing this. I have students who are doing this. That's great. That's great. But there are a lot of people that are nuns, N-O-N-E-S's. They have no official religious identity, which means they just have an implicit one. You can't be free of the need to cultivate wisdom or to get into the sacred. The sacred just means the deepest, most real, the most transformatively, most orienting real for you. You can't have a good life without that. And you know what you want? You want a good life. I bet you, no matter what you're doing, it's oriented towards a good life. So in that sense, and that's why I was hesitant, but I'm spiritual but not religious, right? But there are nuns. There are people that don't have a religious home, and so they need to be afforded a journey so that they could find one or help give birth to one where they are properly homed within an ecology of practices, a community of role models, a tradition of myth that helps them, all of that stuff. So that's a big role. And do I think that AGI could play a role in that? Yeah, like I said, I think that AGI has the potential to exact us. And I gave you a proposal for that. I think enlightenment is the grandest exaptation for which human cognition is possible. It's the greatest one that is possible for human cognition. I think what we're doing in enlightenment is we are exacting, we're repurposing all of our knowings and how they are all potentially synergistically self-organizing. We're repurposing that so that we overcome profound egocentrism. We get reality-centric, and we care about, in a way, that to making as much reality-centric beings as we possibly can. That's maturation. Growing up is to face up to reality. Enlightenment is that kind of exaptive process, and I think there's a potential that AGI could accelerate that in a very powerful way. What was the third thing? I can't remember. There was the AGI, there was the exaptation of the axial religions.
one insertion, and then yes, the other thing was theology is the new science. So,
Right.
so that's there. But the other thing I wanted to prompt you about, because you brought up the sort of being home, sort of philosophically, is also to reference how domicide plays into the meaning
Oh, yes,
crisis,
yes.
and how that might be perhaps ameliorated by, the presence of enlightened machines.
Yeah. Okay. So, which do you want me to do first?
Let's do the latter first, and then we'll come back to
Theology is
theology is the new science.
So domicide is a term that I got from Brian Walsh, not Dennis Walsh. I actually ran into him when I was on a train, just by happenstance, and he introduces the term about how a particular community go through domicide. Domicide, it's from Porteous and Smith. Domicide is the destruction of home. There's two ways I can destroy your home. One is I can destroy your house, which is a dwelling point, and that's horrific, of course. And of course, that's happening in various places around the world right now, and it's horrible. But there's also psychological domicide, in which you have a dwelling. In that sense, you have housing, but you don't have a home. So, for example, I'll give a non-controversial example. I'm traveling right now, and I am away from the woman who is one of the best people I have met in my entire life, and who, well, here, dedication in the book. Here, read that. Here's the dedication. To Sarah, within whom wisdom and love dwell in beauty. So I miss her profoundly. I'm homesick. Not because I don't have safe dwelling. I'm staying in a nice hotel. I'm staying in a really wonderful place. I'm right on the ocean. It's beautiful. It's it's Venice Beach. Yay, great food. I'm not suffering, but I'm experiencing domicide. I'm homesick. I'm profoundly homesick. We have a culture that's homesick. All the symptoms of the meaning crisis. The fact that with just a little bit of provocation, I can make you feel like you're cosmically homeless, that your existence is absurd, insignificant, meaningless. Now, the thing is to give people hope. Nagel came up with this argument. He said, look, the arguments for absurdity are technically invalid. Let me give you an example. Well, what I'm doing won't matter to people a million years from now. Oh, well, that means that what they're doing doesn't matter to me now. It doesn't actually cause absurdity, right? Well, I'm so small. Well, if I made you the size of an Andromeda galaxy, would that do it for you? No. His point is, it's not actually propositional, and then he gets locked up into doubt, which I think is propositional. I think so. I think there's a problem in his essay. But the point is, right, and he does a better job in The View from Nowhere. It's perspectival. It's participatory, right? So you can address this homelessness. And it's not about giving you a propositional answer. It's about teaching you. Remember, I gave you a line of hope. I said, you can reconcile perspectival clash with an insight. And now you have cosmic perspectival clash. But what if you have a profound systematic insight? And it's also systemic. It also deeply aligns all of the levels of your psyche. So you get that massive reciprocal opening. That's the solution. It's a way of being. It's what the Buddhists call prajna. It's non-duality. It's this reciprocal opening. And I think that there is a way that we can individually and collectively cultivate states of seeing, states of being, and being with each other and being with the world and falling in love with reality again, that will alleviate our cosmic domicide.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Now, theology is the new science.
So as I said, our religio is going to become central, and especially the ineffable non-propositional aspects of our religio are going to become more and more central. Why is there such fascination? Why is there this psychedelic renaissance and all the work on mystical experience? I'm trying to get a paper published right now, about the cognitive continuum from fluency, into insight, into flow, into mystical experience, and even into the potential for transformative experience and enlightenment. Why this fascination? Why do my students, right? Because this is what will alleviate the scarcity for, right, the meaning crisis, scarcity, the hunger. It will also give us a place that is relatively immune to what the LLMs can do. But it's also a place that we have to work with because we have to afford the advent of the sacred, which means we can't use the frameworks that we have, both religious and scientific, as they are. We have to exact them so that we can make a space. So like the conversation that takes on a life of its own, our dialogue with the advent of the sacred can take on a life of its own, which is proper to reality actually realizing itself to us. That's the theology of the future.
Heard it here first. Well, probably not first. Wow, that's really compelling. I need to like. That's the type of thought that I feel like I don't want to just jump into more questions because I need to let it digest a little bit.
Yeah.
I guess maybe one sub question to it actually relates to that, which is like, what were the maybe informative insights that led you to that conclusion? Or some, not all.
I mean, first of all, the systematic insight that we're subject to propositional tyranny, and we've reduced all of knowing to the propositional, and we need to, in order to more recover and rehome ourselves in recovered religio, we need to recover and re-enliven and reapprehend and reappreciate the non-propositional, and that can connect us to the mystical traditions cross-culturally and give us a way, by the way, of dealing with another aspect of the meaning crisis. Another aspect of the meaning crisis is 40% on average, this is the best estimation, of the population has anomalous experiences, have experiences of altered states of consciousness of one form of the other. And they don't have a framework for properly integrating it. What matters in psychedelic therapy is, do people have the framework, right? And you've probably heard a little bit about this. You need set and setting. Well, you need more than the two S's of set and setting. You also need a sapiential. Sapiential means having to do with wisdom. You need a whole bunch of practices, ecology of practice, that help you deal with self-deception. Because what psychedelics do is they make you susceptible to bullshit. They really ramp up the salience of things, and they diminish your, everything seems hyper real. And so that's why people don't get addicted to psychedelics. They don't get addicted in the way they get addicted to heroin, but they get addicted to their own particular rabbit hole metaphysics that they tunnel down into, and weird conspirituality and weird narratives, right? You need a sapiential framework. And that sapiential framework has to sit within a sacred narrative. You need to have an overarching mythological, and I mean filled with living symbols of how the agent arena worldview is properly attuned so that you can belong and fit into it. You need the 4 S's, not just the 3.
This is really resonant because, obviously psychedelics research acceptance is on the rise, although unfortunately MAPS hit a recent roadblock. And that's generally, from my perspective, a positive thing.
Yes.
But one thing that I'm observing happen adjacent to it is what the same system the same tendency that happened with cannabis acceptance.
Yes.
Which is that so much of the benefits had to be foregrounded, and all of the possible areas of concern related to set setting, but also, what they do pharmacologically, had to be elided in order to sort of batter down the door.
Excellent point.
And I feel like that same thing is at risk of happening with psychedelics.
Totally. It also happens with the mindfulness revolution. So Britt, I was at a conference, Willoughby Britton, who's done some work, and she has a tough time publishing, but she's published on it about this, the dark side of mindfulness practices. Before when I taught mindfulness professionally, both like within the university and also in a martial arts dojo for decades, and I would always start by warning my students of the weird, dark things that can happen. A lot of weird, dark stuff can happen. And I also always being with, if you start to get these things, that's indication that you're dealing with trauma. Stop doing this practice and get some professional therapy. And if you're in therapy, tell your therapist you're doing this practice. I always did that. And I asked Willoughby, I said, You did all this survey of all these people in North America and Europe teaching mindfulness. How many are explicitly warning their students about the dark side? What's the percentage? 0. Same thing, like you said, with cannabis. You know what? We had a chance. Before, we just arbitrarily chose 18 for alcohol or 19. We just chose, not based on anything. We now had the neuroscience and the cognitive science to say, you know what? The cannabis interferes with frontal lobe development. We should wait till that's developed before people take it. That seems reasonable. We should have, people should have to wait till they're 25. But the teenagers are the people that want to use it. But that's not good, right? That's not good, right? We could have I'm against prohibition. Prohibition doesn't work, and it just provides funding for organized crime. I'm not a prude. I'm not talking about prohibition. I'm talking about licensing. You have to get a license to drive a car. But no, I'm going to give you virtually like a chainsaw for your mind, a very powerful tool, and you don't have to have any licensing, any requisite education. I don't have to make sure that you've properly physiologically matured. We don't let 5-year-olds get married. Right? Come on.
Yeah.
We could have done it. And so you're making an excellent point. And I'm not about prohibition or censorship. I'm an Orwellian. The one political stance I have is I'm Orwellian. I don't want this. I don't want the state to have a lot of power, right? Left or right, I don't care, right? And so I don't want the state intervening in people's lives. Prohibition doesn't work. But it could intervene in the way in which it says, we're not going to prohibit this. We're going to make and what you do is you get incentives. If you do driver's ed, you get reduced insurance. You have to go through in Canada. I don't know what it's like in the States. You have this whole gradated educational program you have to go through before you get a fully autonomous license. Because guess what? Cars can kill people. Yeah. I'm talking about doing exactly that. We have the opportunity here to put aside all of our political proclivities and make a wise decision that is actually not about our particular bloody flag, but about caring for the people that are inevitably going to use this. I've used psychedelics. I can't now because I have Meniere's in my left ear. So that is gone for me, and I'm glad I did. I had started Tai Chi Chuan. I was about 5 years in, and so I was getting into it deeply. And what I wanted is I wanted to know what it was like to do the form Tai Chi. I do the Beijing form in a state of intense flow and reduced egocentrism. So I did it. I did it properly. It's set and setting. I did it with a good friend, right? And played the music and did some yoga, and then went down, walked around, all the right stuff, And then it was a very powerful experience for me. I was on the beach in Toronto, and I'm doing Tai Chi, and there's this little girl, and she comes up to me, and it wasn't a hallucination.
Yeah.
And she's just seeing me in some ways. Her eyes are like saucers, and I'm moving. And I it was the only time I've ever had but I had like blue fire moving through up and down my arms as I'm doing the form. Now you can get all caught up in this in the weird phenomena. But what I was doing is putting that aside. Is I was like the perspectival, participatory knowing. What is it like to be this? Like I was trying to create a deep felt taste in my mind. This is what it's like, so that when I'm not on mushrooms, I can find my way back to that in Tai Chi, and I succeeded in that project.
You referenced ecology of practices. Was that a function of having an ecology of practices? Practices of integration?
Exactly.
I like this tip. I feel like I've learned so much from you on YouTube and in your writings, and your ideas about the out there, but I like that we're now in this place of talking about you as a person. So I'd like to sort of stay here, and think maybe about some of the formative experiences that made you you.
I'm happy to do that, and I trust you, but I'm also entrusting to you. There's a danger here, right? The danger is I don't want to be the focus of anything, right? I want to be a vehicle, but I don't want to be a focus. I've pulled back. I no longer do voices with Vervaeke. We've retooled and created the lectern. I don't talk about followers or fans. I have students, and I'm a teacher, right? And I'm a scientist and a teacher. That's my role. And I understand that there's a certain amount of respect I should earn, and I get that, and recognition. I want recognition for my work because I do think my work is important. All of that's, but I shouldn't be the focus. And we did that pivot because I've seen other people, and they become gurus in the pejorative sense of the word, and that is tempting. That's tempting to a kind of inflation. That's tempting, and I could that temptation and the parasocial relationship that people start to take to me. That's all very tempting, and they were seeing it. The people in Vervaeke Foundation, one of their explicit mandates is to keep me virtuous, and they said we need to pull you back. We need to step back, and I said, yeah, I want to step back and retool. I'm not begging off from what you're proposing. I'm just saying, I'm entrusting you that we'll do this very carefully. I want people to understand. I'm happy to do this if it helps with me presenting like the ideas and the work and being a vehicle. But I don't want to be held up as anything.
Understood. And you have my commitment to keep us right within that sweet spot. I think for me to voice my motivation, it's sometimes illuminating to understand not only what the ideas that have now entered into the world and that are circulating, but to understand how the various folks who sort of discerned them or engaged in them came to them.
Right.
And I'm just sort of copping to my own curiosity. I'm just curious to know. And so when I'm thinking about your formative experiences, I mean, you can take that however you want. My hope is that there are a few moments that help us understand, oh, how did the meaning crisis become important to you? And that maybe charts us back much further than even your, career as a cognitive scientist.
It does.
So that's the place I'm coming from.
Yeah. So I want to try and make this fresh. I've done this a couple times in other places, but how do I say this without sounding like a Hallmark card? I really respect you. I really respect what this conversation. I like the timbre and the tenor of your mind. I like your use of vocabulary, the way you're showing up. It's really calling to me.
Oh, thank
you. I want to try and make this fresh. I don't want to just rehearse. So I'm trying to. I mean, there's things I have to say because there's what happened. So in that sense, I'm rehearsing. But I'm trying to get into a place where how can I make this fresh? So I guess I was brought up in not only in a nuclear family but an extended family of not even an evangelical but a very fundamentalist Christianity. Very, very. And it took some years of therapy and reflection to, first of all, realize how toxic that was, but then also start a longer healing process of rapprochement with Christianity, if I can put it that way. And I'll get to that. Now, that was bound up with a very fraught relationship with my mother and a relatively absent father, who I've now realized. I'm also going through a rapprochement with my parents. Both of them are dead.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. I now realize that I didn't realize that at the time, that I think now that I have the expertise, I think my dad was autistic, high-functioning autistic. He had all the symptoms now, and I recognize. And nobody around him, including myself, understood. And so he was this perpetually frustrating mystery. Why is he behaving this way? And so he's relatively absent, and when he was present, he was a chaotic influence. So I defaulted, as people are in that situation, to my mother. But my mother was this titanic presence. It's hard to not sound Freudian. Oh, please. But right, my mother was she had to be. She was a dominating, powerful person, and the God of the religion I was brought up in, and my mother were not separated within my young mind. And this caused me to have a very fraught relationship. And I only later found out, and it helped me very therapeutically to forgive my mother. So my mother was forced to marry somebody when she was 15. She was basically prostituted, married in order to provide a source of income for the family.
Mm.
And then what happened, as is I think completely compassionately understandable, is she ended up having an affair with the man who turned out to be my father.
Mm.
I am literally a bastard that was born out of breaking up two marriages. My mother kept this all secret from me, but carried this burden. And she carried the burden because she had committed one of the commandment sins of adultery and destroyed the family, and also had defeated her supposed function was to bring income in and all this sort of thing. And so what she basically had to do, she was the black sheep of the family. She was tarred. So when that happens, you do one of two things. You either rebel and reject and divorce yourself from your family, or you go into whatever code they live by and you do it better than they do. So she doubled down on the fundamentalism and the purity code is at the heart, that puritanical thing we talked about earlier. And so she adopted all of that. And then that became vectored onto me. And then she had this fraught relationship with me. There was this profound ambivalence towards me because she would look at me and see her sin. I didn't know this, of course, but I felt the affective resonance about it. She would see her sin, but she called me John. And I once asked her, "Why did you name me John?" She said, "Well, it means a gift from heaven." And she said, "You were born with an old soul." I was like, "What?" She saw, sorry, and this is hard to talk about without sounding self-promotional, so I'll ask for some charity. She saw, I'm the only person, there was one cousin that went into university in my whole extended family. She saw something in me. She saw that whatever it was in me, and that's what she meant by an old soul, and right? She saw that somehow this was a gift, and this was somehow a potential redemption. So in order to deal with this, she had to somehow draw that out from me, but keep me free from any sin. So she also very much tried to sort of desexualize me. Like sexuality, my sexuality was deeply repressed and held back. All of this was all fraught and entangled with this religious view, which is encompassing. I was literally afraid of people who weren't part of not just Christianity, but part of my denomination, my particular. I thought they were evil, right? And so this is very traumatizing. Some of the most traumatic experiences of my life. I remember coming home, and my mother was always home when I came home from school. And it just happened that one time she wasn't. I was like 10 or 11. And this was when kids were allowed to be by themselves when they were 10 or 11. I'm that old. And there was nobody there. And I was convinced that the rapture had occurred. And I had been left behind, which was clear evidence that I was damned and a sinner, and the Antichrist was coming for me. Can you imagine the fear?
Oof.
Another instance, I read in the New Testament, and it's in several places, about the unforgivable sin. And then immediately fraught with anxiety because I'm in this pressure cooker of affective ambivalence that's got this mythological amplification of a religion, right? Well, have I committed that sin? Or maybe, and then in my mind is saying all kinds of, you're doing all these, like I was just overwhelmed with anxiety about the unforgivable sin. And my mother could see I'm in terrific distress. And she takes me to the minister of the church to help me. And he says things that even to a 12-year-old's ear
are empty, useless platitudes. He doesn't help me at all. And so I felt domiciled, trapped within this. And so soon as I could, I was broken open by a couple of books. Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, an amazing science fiction book. Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. Fifth Business, where I was introduced to Jungian psychology, has opened up. I left that all behind, and I became very aggressively anti-religious. Of course, many people do when they leave that kind of toxic fundamentalism. But the thing is, and this is part of the rapprochement, I came to understand that it had left a taste for the transcendent in my mouth. For all of its horrible fraughtness, all the ways it was lacerating me, it also at times offered me, in the paradigmatic figure of Jesus, a view of, well, what I would now call enlightenment. And I couldn't let that go. And so I was in, I'm already in adolescence to begin with. So I go into a titanic meaning crisis of my own. I was going around and writing everywhere, there is no purpose, things like that, right? I was just inflicting it on people around me. I took on this weird, almost oracular status. I was weirdly popular in high school because I became like this oracular person who would pronounce these, for adolescents. And that was like, for adolescents, these really powerful, there is no purpose. Life is its own answer. Rise above yourself and all this stuff. And right? And I had the empowerment of all this semi-unconscious material, archetypal stuff just coming up into me, right? And so that created tremendous inflation, which was also debilitating. It was exacerbating everything. And then I go into university, and I just decide to take a philosophy course. And we read Plato's Republic, and I meet the figure of Socrates. And I'm suddenly offered a doorway out of all of this, a portal. And I realize I want to be him. I want to be him. Now, originally, it's like I want to be him because I want to win all the arguments like he does. There's the adolescence, but Plato is that beauty. He draws you in from your egocentric viciousness, and he draws you beyond yourself towards virtue. That's what makes him Plato, right? And that happened to me profoundly. And I wanted that, And so I go into academic philosophy only to find that the topic of wisdom and the Socratic way of life falls off the table. And all we start talking about is all the project given to us by the Enlightenment about skepticism and rationality and the nature of science and ethics. I appreciate all that all the technicalities of argumentation. Because I appreciate all the rigor that gives me, but the hunger for wisdom is not being met. So down the road from where I'm now living, I'm in my 20s, is a Tai Chi and meditation center. So I go and I start doing what I would now call an ecology of practices. They're in an integrated fashion teaching Tai Chi, Vipassana meditation, and metta contemplation. And I start to go through the non-propositional transformation that is affording the aspiration. And I'm starting to read about Philosophy as a Way of Life by Pierre Hadot and seeing how the ancient philosophy was the kind of philosophy I'm looking for. And all of that's coming alive. And then I hear about this new discipline. I had finished my MA in philosophy and I got so disillusioned, I left the university. But then I'm hearing about this new discipline, I'm doing all this stuff, and I realize cognitive science is the analog to ancient philosophy. And I go into that and I start learning that. I go back and I do a whole new undergraduate degree and get my BSc in cognitive science. And then as that's coming, I'm meeting people like Evan Thompson. He's literally at the University of Toronto. And I'm seeing there's this new version of cognitive science that I originally was resistant to, and then I get called into for ecog sci that's talking about all the non-propositional, talking about meaning, talking about transformation, talking about mindfulness. And I realized the two can come together. Now, Evan was supposed to teach a class called Buddhism and Cognitive Science. He couldn't teach it. And I said, well, who else could possibly teach this class? And he said, John could. So I start teaching this course. I start teaching another course on the psychology of wisdom. And in these courses, I see that the meaning crisis isn't specific to John Vervaeke. My students, they get on fire when I talk about this stuff. Not only the problem of it, but And I start to dig into it, and I start over 10 years, I'm teaching these courses and I'm building this argument. And then one of my students comes to me and he said, you should share this with the world. I'm a trained videographer. My father's a professional editor. For free, I have a crew. We will film this. And that became Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. That's how I got there.
Wow. And how many days, this is like such a, like, that was such an amazing thing to share. And so this question is not meant to diminish that, but just a curiosity, how many days did you film that over? Because it's 50 some odd hours.
So we would film on a weekend, and we would usually film 2 or 3 a day. So it was filmed over multiple months, and we started releasing it before we had finished it. And I'm glad to do that because we were getting feedback, and that helped me tailor later parts of the series. So yeah, it's a lot. So for every hour, you're talking about sort of 2 or 3 hours. So 150 hours sort of went into it all on my end, and then they're doing all the back end work with all the editing and all the stuff that they did, which was really, really. I owe so much to Alan Keown. I owe so much to him and his crew, and his dad, so much. So grateful, and I at the end of the series, I thanked him repeatedly for that.
Thank you again for sharing all of that. Definitely, for me, deepens the sort of context and relational quality to the wisdom, to the knowledge. Thinking about, you referenced the lectern.
Yeah.
Thinking about some of what you learned about your pedagogical approaches and how you imagine yourself moving forward in this educational context. I want to open up to that because I think this is another thing that feels really relevant, of course, to you, but also broadly in culture as we're having this proliferation of courses and like, so I think you're really tapped into something that is meaningful right now.
Yeah, I mean, well, part of it was to try and properly aspire to being a good teacher and to model what that looks like and to try to create a working model that is in contrast to the two options that I'm trying to steer between. One, I'm not prepared to give up yet, which is an academic teacher. I'm still working at the university, but I'm moving towards retirement. I'm 62, right? The meaning crisis can't be reached within my reach within the academic world is not sufficient for addressing the meaning crisis. That's no slight on anything. That's just a fact. And here's the thing: when I did Awakening to the Meaning Crisis, my connection to other academics went up exponentially. My publications went up because of my connections. Almost everybody I'm working with, I got because they saw Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Speaking of ecologies.
Yeah. So so I need to step away from just within the standard academic. Now, that institution still is important, and that's where the research is happening. So, I mean, putting that aside, but addressing the meaning crisis, the advent of the sacred requires something else. But I want to also, so that's Scylla. The Charybdis I want to avoid is the guru, the YouTube guru, that does not represent, frequently does not represent, well, insofar as it's guru, does not represent the Socratic ideal of what, like Socrates compared himself to a midwife. He helped people to give birth to themselves. That's what is needed for the advent of the sacred and for dealing with domicide. We need that. And that Socratic ideal is not well exemplified by many of the models and the medium, the way YouTube is running. When I did Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, many people said, what? Nobody's going to watch that. And I thought, maybe you're right. Maybe it's doomed. But a lot of people did. And I found out, hundreds of thousands of people did. And I found out that a lot of people have watched it multiple times. People have created study groups, which is what I most wanted around it. And so, yeah. And that's why I'm exploring other options. I mean, I'm doing the lectern where I'm doing courses on my own platform. doing a course that's really, I'm enjoying it so much, and there's such a reception for it, called Einstein and Spinoza's God. In fact, some of the people that, it's obviously online, but some of the people that are in the LA area, I'm going to meet up with them tomorrow from the course.
Amazing.
And it's the idea that, you know, Einstein's God is Spinoza's God, specifically, explicitly, by the way. He's a follower of Spinoza. Of course, Einstein is a pivotal figure, and Einstein is getting us beyond a lot of the dualities that we were given by sort of the Newtonian Enlightenment worldview. And one of the dualities he's trying to get beyond is theism, atheism. Einstein vigorously, consistently rejected the label of an atheist, contrary to how Dawkins sort of talks about him. But he also consistently rejected standard personal theism, that God is sort of a being, a personal-minded being, and he talked about cosmic religion. And then this goes back to Spinoza, who was dealing with an earlier version of that by Descartes, and he was trying to. Spinoza is trying to deal with the beginnings of the meaning crisis within modernity, right at the beginnings of the scientific revolution. He's a pivotal figure. It's no wonder that Einstein becomes attracted to him. So this is what the course is on. I'm doing that. I'm doing a course on Jonathan Pajot's Symbolic World on the cognitive science of ritual, also well attended. I've done 3 courses for the Peterson Academy. I've done one on, which is out right now, intelligence, rationality, wisdom, and spirituality, about the kind of stuff we're talking about here right now. Apparently, it's being very well received. I've got another one out just on a general introduction to the nature of general intelligence, and then another one on the primacy of beauty. And I'm going to do a couple more for them. And I'm exploring all of these options because I'm trying to learn how can we still steer between Scylla and Charybdis and come up with virtue with virtuosity that will educate people in the way that Socrates or Siddhartha would approve of, in order to help them overcome the domicile of the meaning crisis and hopefully afford the advent of the sacred.
This feels like a good moment to discuss your forthcoming series, Walking the Philosophical Silk Road.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
I have a very dear friend, a person who I admire, Bishop Maximus. He's a bishop in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And I love Bishop Maximus, to just put it. I've told him, I said, if I were to become a Christian, I would become an Eastern Orthodox Christian because of him. Also, Jonathan Pajot is an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And he took me aside. And the thing is, please understand, he reaches out to me and he says, I know that John, you're not a Christian, John, but like what you're doing is so valuable, and I want to enter into good faith, deep dialogos with you. And he does, and he shows up, right? Without ever trespassing upon his integrity and his commitment to his religious home. And he walks that in a way that's just completely admirable. Like, he's exemplary. But he took me aside. I was actually in Etna. He was there at the seminary, and I came there, and I sort of got to stay with the monks, which was like wonderful. I have a secret longing to be a monk. I could never do it because I couldn't give up sex, but I and I wouldn't give up my relationship with Sarah. But I was really, really deeply touched by that whole community. Good people living good lives. But he's so very welcoming. I want to make sure that we understand the context in which he did this. It's not like some person, telling me what to do. He took me aside gently and said, John, stop talking about the religion that's not a religion. He was one of the people that made the criticism and opened me up. And he said, it's not doing anything, and you're just alienating everybody. And he was part of this, and he was getting the intuition about, and he said, you're talking more about like this sort of Silk Road project. He said, talk more about that. I love that. That's good. And that made me really reflect on it. It was like, okay, what am I thinking of? Well, I'm thinking about something analogous to what the Silk Road was. The Silk Road joins the East and the West together, and it leads to this world-transforming communication of ideas and ways of life and worldviews. And what happened is nobody lives on the Silk Road. People move on it. They move between their homes, or they move from one home to another, right? This is like C.S. Lewis's idea. Paul Vanderklay put me onto this, of what he called hallway Christianity. People live in the rooms, but you need hallway Christianity to move between the rooms. You need the Silk Road. People will live here or there in this religion or that religion. Remember, I mean philosophy too, right? But they need the Silk Road to move between them. I thought, oh, I want to do something like that, because what happened is they created. Like I want to coin this term, like not a lingua franca, but a lingua philosophica, so that all of these different, they could all talk to each other, and in a way that's mutually transformative, like that living conversation we were talking about. You and I don't have to come to an agreement at the end, but we can both have moved to in ways that we both find valuable. We've been both called into transformation by that living conversation. And I was thinking, okay, well, the Silk Road did that. What if I, right? What if I could make myself a vehicle for the advent of the sacred by going on a pilgrimage on the Silk Road, like literally going to places, right? And what would I do? And I'm thinking, what I'm going to do is trying to, what was the lingua philosophica of the West? It was Neoplatonism. So I'm going to go to all, because it runs through Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and the scientific revolutions. I'm going to go to all the places in Europe and even in Alexandria, because Bishop Maximus might meet me there to talk about Clement of Alexandria and talk about the Neoplatonic heritage. And then that moved west. And what was moving from the east is something that takes Buddhism and Taoism and Shinto, and it's Zen. And Zen's moving. And these two have been talking to each other for decades. You have prototypical, some of my heroes, the Kyoto School, Nishida, D.T. Suzuki, Nishida, Nishitani, Maso Abe, right, Tanabe, trying to bridge between the Neoplatonism vectored through Heidegger, who didn't realize he was a Neoplatonist, even though more and more people are now acknowledging that, right? And they're trying to bridge in order to address the meaning crisis. Religion and Nothingness by Nishitani is about one of the top 5 books I've read multiple times in my life, and it is about addressing the meaning crisis by getting this East-West philosophical Silk Road to happen. And so I want to go to Kyoto. I want to go to where Nicholas of Cusa was. I want to go to I'm going to go and film, and I'm going to meet in the middle, because Vedanta is also playing an important role. Sankara, right? And of course, Nagarjuna is there. And then I'm also going to go into Samarkand and talk about, I can't go into Iran for obvious reasons. I want to talk about Suravardi and right, and Ibn Arabi from Andalus to get them on, right? I'm going to be in Spain too, so I'm going to go all around the world like a travelogue, but I'm called to this. This isn't a project. This is a pilgrimage for me, because the non-propositional has to be given a voice, and I have to make a space in myself for letting however the advent of the sacred is going to take on a life of its own, express itself to me. I have to make myself perpetually vulnerable to this. I've made a commitment that for each one of these thinkers, these sages, I am going to try and hear and see something in them I have never heard or seen before, by going there and soaking up the geophilosophy, the place where they were, the culture, the language, the music, and there's going to be animation. There's going to be like a documentary film for that. That's the upper level, trying to create a new genre. Then there's going to be a middle level. There's going to be a 20-episode lecture series like Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, going through the argument in more detail for each one of these thinkers and finding the through line through all of them. Hoping to film that at Ralston College, where I did one of the talks on Neoplatonism, because it epitomizes the pedagogical vision that I aspire to. Ralston is a fantastic place that more people need to know about and to support. It is representing what education, institutionalized education should be, higher education should be. And I've spoken there, and their students are glorious. And they're graduate level students, and have them as a living audience as I give the lecture series. And then below that will be video essays like I did for the AGI, the LLMs, for those people who want to dig into more technical, rigorous arguments. And then below this is the codex. I mentioned to you where we have people coming up with all the Wikipedia of all of the language, and people will be able to move between all 4 of these levels at different rates and different degrees of accessibility. That is the Philosophical Silk Road project.
Well, that sounds monumental.
It's probably my culminating work. Um, and um, and there's terrific interest in it. We're in the fundraising stage. I'm on sabbatical starting January, so that's what that sabbatical's for. Explicitly, officially approved by the university, so I'm not doing anything I'm not supposed to be doing. And you can see why. It's about addressing the meaning crisis, affording the advent of the sacred, and really trying to experiment with the pedagogical possibility of this medium, multimedia, in fact, right? And so, yeah, we already got a lot of interest. But if anybody's interested, we're raising funding. We're trying to raise about $360,000, and we got a lot of people already committing to this. It looks very, very much like we're going to raise the money, and it's going to happen. And so that's the Philosophical Silk Road project. There is a website now, Philosophical Silk Road, for those of you who are interested. You can go and look at it and see the places and see the sages and just get an overall sense of what the Philosophical Silk Road is. And my hope is by doing this, we will give that lingua philosophica so we get the living conversation. So now, in addition to ecologies of practices, we have an ecology of traditions that can most properly open up to and orient to the advent of the sacred in order to create a worldwide way of addressing the meaning crisis. That is the fraught ambition that is driving this project.
I love that. One question that arises, but it also connects to the AI discussion and also the lectern discussion, is the methods by which you're ensuring or seeking to ensure that you're represented. Like when you're talking about all these different figures from throughout the Silk Road, what are the methods by which you're ensuring, to the best of your ability, that you're interacting faithfully with the histories of those figures, but also the possible bias that might exist with the Silk Road, and the way that Neoplatonism factors in. So talk to me a little bit about that.
So part of it is, I did talk about this in Awakening Freedom, the meaning crisis. I won't pretend to do the view from nowhere, because I've already told you that's bullshit. That is profoundly bullshit. What I can do is to try to be as vulnerable and as open and as open to self-criticism, as reflective of my bias as possible. And why did I choose the people I chose? I chose those people because they're simultaneously exemplary, and they call to me, because part of how this is going to be conveyed, part of the way I'm teaching, is how I will undergo this, not just what I will say, but how I will undergo this. Chris is going to be there a lot, and he's going to be acting almost like a father confessor figure. Many other people are going to be there and are going to be showing up at places along the way, and there's going to be this dialogue. And I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know how I'm going to end up, where I'm going to end up. That is how I'm going to be honest about this. I can't pretend I'm going to get everybody who should be there. I can't do that. I can't pretend I'm going to be unbiased, because I need to be. I need to make this as involving, as existentially involving as I possibly can. So what I can do is try to be as reflectively transparent and as vulnerable about that as I possibly can. So that is my attempt to answer that question. Why did I choose the two I chose? Because, I didn't even make this argument. Arthur Voss Lewis, in a series of astonishing books, has made the clear argument that Neoplatonism is the spiritual backbone of the West, and Zen is like it's sort of the grand unified thing of the East, and Vedanta in India, and Vedanta and Tantra and sort of proto Zen Buddhism are all in India and in Samarkand, and that's why, and that's how I chose, and I tried to choose from all of the traditions. That's and we are going to use music and animation and other people probing me about this, and like I say, the place and the atmosphere and the taste and texture to try and presence these people and make their perspectives living perspectives as much as possible. That's the goal. I don't want to just present their propositions. Look, one of the most profound experiences that happened to me is I was reading Spinoza's Ethics, and I'm reading his propositions, and I looked up, and I got scientia intuitiva, and I saw the world spinozistically. I wasn't thinking about his propositions about the world. It became adverbial. I was seeing the way he saw. This is what I want everybody to encounter on the philosophical Silk Road. They can still disagree, I hope they do, with all of these thinkers, all of these sages. But when you're on the Silk Road, you want to see what somebody has seen. The word theoria, where we get our word theory from, originally meant to travel on a journey, to behold something you haven't seen before in order to transform you. That's the original meaning of theoria. I want to get behind the theory to the theoria.
I also, just as an aside, love how you bring in these root words and help us understand how the deep, deep etymology of the word does and can connect back to extremely contemporary pursuits.
Yeah, so I call that sort of like re-exaptation. Go back into the etymological root, which almost always goes back into sensory motor, like going on a journey. Re-enliven that, and then bring that back to refresh your conceptual understanding.
Again, sort of tangent on a tangent. Now I'm thinking about AI and the way that language is everything when it comes to particularly large language models. Do you see any connection with this new journey that you're setting out to do and the work you've done with AI and some of the ways you're thinking about, the relationship between our sort of deep theoretical or theoria pasts and where we are in the present and sort of where we're orienting toward the futures?
Yeah, I mean, you point to something very valuable. The LLMs. So one thing that is scientifically important, and I should have brought this up, I forgot. I was being largely critical last time. And I didn't say this in the video essay. And so this is a chance to correct myself for a previous error. So up until the LLMs, we were facing the silo problem with AI. It wasn't AGI, which was you could create machines that were sort of single domain, single problem solvers. They were really good in this particular domain, playing Go or playing chess or playing a small set of overlapping kinds of games or something like that, but not doing the kind of thing we did. And then it turned out that language gives you access out of the silos. It gives you a through line between the silos in a way that we didn't properly foresee. And then what we found is that through line has got so much of our worldview actually built into it. These things can learn in scare quotes, about the world because of how we have packed so much in that language. And I talked before about that's a correlation, and we shouldn't forget that. But now talking positively, it's like, oh, that means we should even more do the kind of thing we were just talking about. We should go back and see what can we get out of by diving into the language and really re-exapting it powerfully. So the AI I was doing that before because I was deeply influenced by Heidegger, who would be absolutely horrified by these machines, by the way. But when I saw that, now I get to do a tangent on a tangent. So I saw that and I went, oh, wow. Heidegger's kind of right. Language is the home of being. Not completely, because you don't want to get into propositional tyranny, but there's something going on there. So John, really start to even more seriously play with like the way language is impregnated with a worldview, right? And do this re-exaptation. And some people don't like me doing that. I'm not going to stop doing that for that reason. Right? But then I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about what that means, and I'm realizing that there's just so much more potential about how these machines can open up our attitude towards our own language use. They could help us to recover what they actually depend on. Remember, I said if you train them on their own linguistic products, they get stupider. that's a pedagogical potential for us to reflect back on and see, okay, let's really be much more careful and full of care about how we're using language. One of the things that pisses people off about me is I try to be very, very careful about how I use my language. And the machines have only accelerated that and given me just cause for that.
Totally. And you're also bringing up, there's an artist I've worked with named Mina Tairu, who has done a series of experiments with image generators. So similar generative AI zone, but on the text to image side. And she's Nigerian and wanted to see what Midjourney, following your example of scare quotes, understood about black hairstyles. And you might not be surprised to hear that Midjourney doesn't understand black hairstyles nearly as well, or produce black hairstyles in nearly as high fidelity as white hairstyles because of the data sets. Thinking about language and thinking about, so language is also text image pairs are part of diffusion models, but thinking about large language models where that's the whole thing, there's not only the opportunity to re-exapt and dive into the potentiality, but also to reflect back on what are the oversights, what are the inherent biases in our language systems.
Yes, that's right.
that have led to historical harms.
Yes, very, very much so. And this is part of my thing, that if we make certain choices and we decide to, unleash like autonomous rational agents on the world, one of the ways to properly curate and mentor them is, let's be much more careful about our language and the language that we're putting out. And the problem we have is that social media, with its adversarial rather than opponent processing and its enhancement of simplistic narrative over subtle narrative, and even the fact that music is becoming less complex decade by decade, right, is driving us in exactly the wrong direction. And it's exacerbated by the pseudo-anonymous status that people have when they're on social media, which also is draining us of the depth that we're actually going to need to recover in language.
I'm really appreciating this idea of re-exaptation as it relates to language, because it also reflects back to an earlier moment in the conversation talking about reality and the way in which that too is a relational orientation.
That's right.
Kind of like it's reflexive, it's recursive. I'm throwing that to you. Does that factor in when you're thinking about re-exaptation?
Yeah. I mean, I think, but it factors into something very deep, something that is at the core of Zen and Neoplatonism. Look, you want personal stuff. Look. Look, I'm carrying around a frog of my commitment to Neoplatonism. This is a symbol from Neoplatonism because it starts in one world and it moves to another. This is right, my tiger eye, because this is my commitment to Zen. I'm a Zen Neoplatonist, right? This is where they converge. We talked a little bit about non-duality, right? But this is the idea. This comes out of like the astonishing book by James Filler on Heidegger, Neoplatonism, and the history of being, relation as ontological ground, and related books that are coming out. And I alluded to this, where we're now realizing that Heidegger was a Neoplatonist, even though he didn't realize it. And that's why he recognized his work in Zen. He explicitly said this on multiple occasions. We think, and this is in the Aristotelian West, not in the Eastern Orthodox, because Eastern Orthodox Christianity went Neoplatonic, down the Neoplatonic route rather than the Aristotelian. People, okay, what's he going on about? Why is he talking about all these technicalities? Look, Aristotle's model is that the world is, and this has to do with language, and this is about like a deeper re-exaptation. So stick with me for a minute.
I'm with you.
Aristotle thought that the world is organized the way language is the way language is organized, the way the logic based on logic comes from logos, which is also for word language. It's all related, okay? Which is a subject predicates, right? We think the world is basically made up of nouns and verbs. And so there's a thing, and it's doing something, or something's being done to it, right? That's how we see the world. So that is the notion of an Aristotelian substance. We think when we hear substance, we think stuff. The original meaning is something that independently exists, that is the thing that stands under substance, all the verbs. It's what grounds them and gives them existence. So reality is ultimately dependent on independently existing things. And then Aristotle argues that relations emerge out of things. Okay, what Filler argues, very long and sophisticated argument. I've just recorded a conversation with him that's going to come out on the lectern. I recommend his book very highly, and he's got a sequel coming out. There's a new book I just seen that I got to get into, also about the deep connections between Heidegger, non-discursive thought, non-propositional thought, and Neoplatonism. This is all taking off. So this is not just me on some little rabbit hole, okay? So what James argues, I call him James because I consider him a friend, James Filler, he said, well, look, there's a really big problem with this. He said, you can't actually fit relations into a substance world because, okay, so the world is made up of things, right? Where are the relations? Is it a property of the thing? Well, if it's a property of the thing, then you only need one thing because then it would belong to the relation. It would belong to the substance. You follow me? But relations are quintessentially between at least two things. So well, it's not in either one of the things. It's in something between them. But what is that when you say all of reality is ultimately based on individually existing things? And then you think, well, wait, this relationality, that's actually, right? That's actually what information is. Information is a relational entity. It's a relation between events. Information isn't a thing, it's a relation between events. Intelligibility, the ability to make sense of things, is a relationship between the events. And Nishida in the Kyoto School says, well, look, there has to be something below the subject and the predicate that puts them into relation to each other, that makes your logic even possible. And so what they converge on is this idea that the relationality is primary and the relata emerge out of the relation, the things related. And so this is a really fundamental exaptation. You have to go into your language and you have to stop automatically seeing through it and step back and look at it. I'm taking my glasses off and pointing at them, right? In order to realize, oh, I have to see the framing within language and not fall into a performative contradiction. I have to realize the place from which I'm speaking the subject-predicate language is not itself a subject-predicate place. Nishida called it basho, which is the Japanese word for place, right? Right? And he would say things like, you have the whole subject-predicate system of colors, but the system is not itself a color. It is a no thing in the world of colors. It is a non-duality no thing. And when you go deeper into this, you get that, okay, but even the relations aren't ultimate because the relation between the relations and the relata is deeper. So you have to have something that's even deeper. See what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to push you really, really deep into, we're getting to the idea that that reality is fundamentally this pure relationality, which is like also like it's it's the grounding possibility for information, for intelligibility, for logic, for everything. And yet there's no place, we can't get beneath it to make sense of it because it is that by which we make sense of everything. So it in of itself is not intelligible to us, even though it is that which radiates all of intelligibility for us. So when we exapt language deeply, we encounter the sacred.
Boom. Love that. I recognize that this conversation could go on for many more hours and there would be no shortage of stuff for us to talk about. But you're in Los Angeles. You have other things to do. You've been so generous with your time already.
I've loved it. I've loved every minute of it.
Oh, that's so good to hear. And as have I. I have 3 questions that I like to close every episode with. You've inevitably hit on possible answers to these questions. Feel free to call those back in or feel free to take it in a totally different direction.
Okay.
So the first question is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
their need for wisdom. Wisdom is not optional. And you're either unconsciously, sporadically, and forgive me, ineptly trying to cultivate wisdom, or you're doing it reflectively, explicitly, and dialogically with the help of many great minds and models. That's the only choice. That's the only choice. Not everybody has to be a philosopher, but everybody has to be a lover of wisdom.
Amazing. What is one resource that you would recommend or that you use for making better sense of reality?
Plato.
Plato.
Yeah. If I had to be stranded on a desert island, well, I'd like two books. I'd like Plato and Plotinus. But the dialogues of Plato and Plotinus is Aeneid. But you can't really read Plotinus on his own. It won't make any sense. You need Plato. The thing that Plato is sacred to me, and what I mean by sacred is I can go back. I can find a depth, and it's an inexhaustible. This is what reality is. Reality is an inexhaustible fount of intelligibility that provokes insight and innovation in my life. That's what reality is, right? And I find that realness. I get realized by as I realize. I have a realization of Plato's works. And I go out and I'm transformed by how I interact with the world, and the world discloses itself in new ways. And then I come back and I look at Plato and I see more deeply into Plato, and that does not stop happening.
Amazing. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
I've had, depends. The problem is there's been very negative moments of horror. Horror is the sense that your sense of reality, horror is not terror. Terror is our fear of predation, things jumping on us and attacking us. And most horror movies are not horror movies. They're predation movies. There's a monster that's going to kill us. A genuine horror movie is a movie that makes you, like The Shining, makes you realize that you don't have, your grip on reality is being challenged. The fear in horror is the fear of insanity, right? And so that moment when I came home and there was nobody at home. But I've also had other moments where I'm on the horizon of horror. And Rilke said, beauty is an angel that could kill us but doesn't. And you have a profound shining of beauty. My first mystical experience, I was still living with my parents. Had broken out of this, the Christian, the fundamentalist Christian, so I was secretly meditating at night because they wouldn't know. And I still was living in my first year of university. I was reading Plato's Republic, and I was on my bunk bed. We were very, very poor, which was another thing. And so my sister's on the lower bunk bed, and I'm at the top. I'm near the ceiling, and I'm sitting up in the dark, and so nobody can know what I'm doing. And I'm meditating, and I realized the Platonic forms, my very first mystical experience, and my whole sense of what reality is and what it could be opened up to me. And that's the other reason why I'm a Neoplatonist, Zen Neoplatonist.
Amazing. Thank you for those. You referenced a bunch of things that are underway, but this is also the moment where I'd love to invite you to share any specific details about those things, where folks can find you, and anything else that we haven't talked about that you'd love to share.
Yeah, I'd like to, first of all, do a shout out to another really important person, a colleague, friend, dear friend of mine, Greg Enriquez. He and I are writing a book on consciousness together.
Amazing.
And Greg is first author, and I'm second author. And he and I have done a lot of things together on my channel under the Cognitive Science Show, Untangling the World Not about Consciousness, and the Elusive Eye with Chris about the self. So that book, we about 5 chapters written. That will be coming out, I hope, next year. I'm teaching a course on consciousness at the university and I'm very grateful for my students because I'm basically, guinea pigging a lot of the ideas and arguments for the book with them, and they're helping tremendously. So that's coming out. I mentioned I'm doing the Cognitive Science of Ritual, and I'm doing a whole course for Jonathan's Symbolic World platform, Jonathan Pesho. I'm also doing a course at the university on the Cognitive Science of Religion for the very first time, and I'm making this whole argument about I'm not going to tell you what religion is. I'll start with a definition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that enlightenment straitjacket and I'm going to shred it. And then how does reality disclose itself to you when that has been shredded? And what occurs to you intuitively, naturally, that you might be willing to call religion as that happens?
Those students are very lucky to have that class.
Well, thank you for saying that. I hope other people will feel that, because the other big project I'm doing on the sabbatical, in addition to the book on consciousness, is I'm turning that argument about the cognitive science of religion into a book. It's going to be, the subtitle is something like Realizing the Relevance of Religion. I haven't figured out what the primary title is, because my second author, my Plato, Christopher, has said, we got to come up with a really good title. Realizing the Relevance of Religion. Good subtitle, John. Not a good title. So I'm waiting for him to come up with the title. And he is going, so what I'm taking, and my students are helping me tremendously. I'm having, it's one of those situations where I'm getting into the flow state while I'm lecturing, I'm having insights, I'm recording, they're giving me their notes very graciously, very helpfully. I'm going to turn all that into a book. I'm going to write that down, and then Chris is going to take it and do his Platonic magic with it.
Amazing.
So that's coming out, hopefully. We'll be working on that next year, and then that'll probably come out hopefully towards the end of next year, beginning of the following year. Those are all the big projects I can think of.
Just those?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Just those. Yeah.
Well, seriously, thank you so much for spending the time today. It's been a true joy to speak with you.
A genuine joy to speak with you, Jesse. Thank you so very much.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.